roots in Sicily, a world of fiefs and peasants. The story we are about to explore begins in a place where time seemed to move more slowly, where arid mountains blended with fields of golden wheat and lemon orchards that released a penetrating fragrance under the Mediterranean sun. Sicily, the island located in the heart of the sea, was for centuries a crossroads of civilizations, conquered and dominated by Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Normans, Spaniards, and French. Each of those peoples left their mark on the land and the culture, but none managed to erase the deep sense of abandonment that defined the lives of its inhabitants. At the end of the 18th century and during much of the 19th century, Sicily was a forgotten territory, trapped in a feudal system where power rested in the hands of a few landowners, the so-called gabelotti, while most of the population survived in misery, working the land without rights or hopes of progress. The peasants lived under a climate of permanent mistrust. They could not rely on official justice because the courts were slow, corrupt, or simply inaccessible to ordinary people. They could not expect protection from the carabinieri, who answered to distant interests and were more concerned with obeying their superiors than with defending the peasantry. In that vacuum of real authority began to emerge figures who offered protection, a kind of local guardians who imposed order where the state did not reach. What is interesting is that they did not present themselves as common bandits, but as men of honor, people whose word had more value than a sealed document, and whose reputation was enough to settle disputes without the need for judges. That environment of fertile lands guarded by armed men gave shape to a complex framework. The landowners, unable to control every corner of their properties, began to rely on overseers who recruited trusted men to protect harvests and livestock. From that relationship, a tacit pact would be born. The powerful maintained their wealth, and the armed men gained prestige, money, and, little by little, power. That rudimentary structure, which began as an informal security system, would eventually transform into a clandestine network with its own codes. It was a system that followed a very simple logic. When the state fails, others fill the vacuum. In this setting, the concept of honor appeared, understood as an invisible capital that could mean the difference between life and death. A man considered honorable was respected, and his family enjoyed a certain degree of security, because no one dared to challenge him without assuming grave consequences. That idea, so deeply rooted in Sicilian culture, was the foundation upon which the law of silence, the famous Omertà, was built. Whoever kept silent, lived. Whoever spoke, betrayed. And the traitor always paid a price. In this way, an alternative system of values was forged, where loyalty to the clan stood above any other institution. The peasants accepted this reality because, in practice, it worked better than the empty promises of the central government. It was more useful to turn to a local boss to recover a stolen animal, or to settle a land dispute, than to wait months for a judge to issue a ruling. In a place where poverty was almost absolute and hope was limited to surviving one more day, the mafia, although it did not yet officially carry that name, became a form of social organization that offered immediate solutions, although at an increasingly high price. As the years passed, what began as protection turned into extortion. The same men who guaranteed security against bandits began to demand regular payments to maintain that peace. The line between justice and threat disappeared, and the population found itself trapped in a circle from which it was impossible to escape. However, in the minds of many peasants, playing along with these guardians was preferable to confronting them, because they had proven to be more effective than any external force. This climate explains why Sicily was fertile ground for the birth of a clandestine power that did not need to present itself as the enemy of the people, but as their protector. It was a world in which violence was always present, but wrapped in a narrative of respect and tradition. That mixture of fear and admiration gave legitimacy to the first clans, who gradually began to act as mediators between the rich and the poor, between desperate peasants and distant landowners. It is important to understand that we are not speaking of a group organized from the beginning, with clear hierarchies or a defined plan. The mafia did not appear overnight. It was formed over decades, almost as a reflection of society's shortcomings. There was no other way to survive than to trust those who imposed their will through force, but who also offered tangible results. Thus, what began as a local phenomenon eventually spread across the island, generating a culture of silence and obedience that would mark entire generations. The power of these groups was not limited to the economic. They also shaped social and family life. A mafia boss could decide whether a young man was worthy of marrying a certain woman, whether a dispute between neighbors should be settled with money or with blood, or even whether a peasant deserved to keep the piece of land he cultivated. Their decisions were unquestionable because they were backed by the threat of reprisals. But not everything was based on fear. The mafia knew how to build an image of a fair arbiter, a power close at hand compared to the distant bureaucracy of Naples or Rome. Over time, this perception consolidated to the point that people saw it as natural to turn to the men of honor for any important matter. That normalization was perhaps the most dangerous key, because what was clandestine ceased to feel strange and became part of the social fabric. The mafia did not present itself as a problem, but as a solution. And in a territory punished by centuries of invasions, abuses, and neglect, that solution seemed the only viable one. The 19th century would bring profound changes for Italy and for Sicily in particular, but none of that can be understood without taking into account this initial breeding ground. The mafia arose from need, from lack, and from mistrust of official power. It was forged in a world where honor was worth more than written law, and where the word of a boss carried more weight than the signature of an official. In that silence, loaded with tensions, a tradition was forged that would soon grow beyond what was imaginable. And while the island remained trapped in its cycles of poverty and dependence, the clans began to look further ahead, sensing that the political chaos that was approaching would open doors to increase their influence. What until that moment was a local power would begin to expand, seeking to take advantage of the cracks in a country that was about to be completely transformed. The birth of honor and the secret society. In the villages of Sicily, between the end of the 18th century and the first years of the 19th century, the word honor began to turn into a value as powerful as blood itself. It was not an abstract concept nor a literary whim. It was a rule of life, a kind of invisible shield that marked the difference between being respected or being humiliated, between being feared or being a victim. In a world where the state proved incapable of offering real protection, where official justice seemed designed for the rich, and where disputes could transform into tragedies from one day to the next, honor became a mechanism of defense, but also a weapon of power. Sicilian society of that time functioned around personal bonds. Written contracts were weak, the law was seen as a foreign imposition, and peasants deeply distrusted everything that came from central bureaucracy. What truly carried weight was a man's word, the promise made in front of witnesses, with his reputation at risk if he failed to fulfill it. That reputation, passed down from generation to generation, could open doors or close them forever, could secure work on an estate or condemn an entire family to social isolation. In this context of rigid customs and personal relations, the first clandestine groups began to take shape. They did not call themselves mafiosi, far from it, but instead presented themselves as circles of men of honor, guardians of traditions that escaped the control of the state. They were closed associations, difficult to penetrate, with initiation rituals meant to separate the common man from the chosen one, the one willing to place loyalty to the group above everything else. They were not mere thieves, but individuals who claimed for themselves the role of judges and mediators. The rites of initiation were fundamental. Simple symbols were used, but ones loaded with meaning. A piece of paper with a sacred image burned in the hands of the initiate, oaths pronounced under the threat of death in case of betrayal, words that turned the new member into part of a secret brotherhood. Popular religion, deeply rooted in the island, mingled with fear and with the solemnity of those ceremonies, creating the feeling that one was entering into more than an organization. It was almost a destiny. Honor and loyalty were so important that an unwritten code of absolute silence was built, the famous Omertà. This principle dictated that any problem must be resolved within the community and never through state authorities. Whoever denounced a mafioso to the police not only put his own life in danger, but also that of his family, and was furthermore branded as someone unworthy of trust. Silence became a form of identity, a blood pact that crossed generations and reinforced the idea that men of honor stood above common law. The concept of Omertà did not appear out of nowhere. It was, to a certain extent, the logical response to centuries of foreign domination. Every time a new conqueror arrived in Sicily, he imposed his rules, collected taxes, and tried to control the population without caring for their well-being. The peasant learned to remain silent, to hide what he thought, to trust only his own. With time, that instinct of survival turned into an almost sacred principle. Silence as a synonym of honor, reserve as a form of resistance. From these foundations, an invisible network began to consolidate, one that worked with surprising efficiency. If someone suffered a theft, he went to the local chief and not to the police. If there was a dispute over land boundaries, it was the man of honor who mediated and pronounced sentence. If a family needed protection against bandits, they sought refuge under the wing of a clandestine group. In this way, the organization acquired power without needing to appear as a visible army. It was enough with the reputation, with the fear their names inspired, with the certainty that those who belonged to that secret society were capable of fulfilling their threats. The appeal of these groups lay in the fact that they offered something the state had never given to peasants: quick and close solutions. For the landowner, having a pact with a man of honor meant security for his crops, peace for his finances, and the possibility of keeping workers under control. For the peasants, it meant a network of protection that could save them from the most immediate abuses. Nobody dared to confront the clans, because doing so meant challenging an entire community bound together by loyalty and fear. As it consolidated, this secret society began to adopt more structured characteristics. There were hierarchies, although not always visible to outsiders. The chiefs, known for their intelligence or their ferocity, gave orders to local captains, who in turn controlled small groups of trusted men. Everything worked in isolated compartments, so that the fall of one link did not put the whole chain at risk. This cellular system, long before it was called by that name, guaranteed survival against investigations and made it almost impossible for the authorities to dismantle the organization as a whole. The combination of honor, silence, and shadowy structure gave rise to an increasingly influential network that soon began to extend its power beyond villages and fields. The myth of the man of honor, capable of dispensing justice where no one else could, became a central element of Sicilian culture. Stories were sung about their courage, rumors were passed down about their exploits, and an aura of respect was woven that, although built on violence, ended up giving them social legitimacy. What is fascinating is that, in its early stages, this brotherhood was not perceived as an external threat, but rather as a part of the natural order of life in Sicily. People knew they existed, knew what they did, but accepted their presence as something necessary, as a lesser evil compared to the chaos of insecurity and official corruption. It was precisely this social acceptance that allowed the organization to grow without meeting much resistance. The man of honor did not need to hide in the shadows because, in a way, everyone recognized him as someone indispensable. The seed was planted. What at first seemed like a local custom, a way of resolving disputes in the absence of justice, transformed into an organization with its own rules, with a language full of symbols, with rituals that reinforced belonging. The mafia, although it had not yet adopted the name by which the world would know it, already existed as a palpable reality, a society parallel to the state that answered to its own codes. From that moment on, the story would no longer be limited to the fields of Sicily or to isolated villages. The 19th century was marked by political changes of great magnitude, and those men of honor knew how to see in the chaos a unique opportunity to expand their influence. Because while the island remained trapped in poverty, the rest of Italy was moving towards a radical transformation. And in that new scenario, the clans discovered that they could be much more than local guardians. They could become political, economic, and social actors of the first order. The unification of Italy and the mafioso opportunity. The 19th century brought with it a wind of change that shook the structures of power throughout Europe, and the Italian peninsula was not left on the sidelines of that agitation. For centuries, Italy had not existed as a unified country, but rather as a mosaic of kingdoms, duchies, and states dominated by foreign powers that disputed its control. In that fragmented scenario, Sicily had been a land of passage, coveted for its strategic position in the Mediterranean, but abandoned when it came to development and progress. When the ideas of national unity began to spread, and revolutionary movements set the streets on fire, the island became a board where political chaos and the absence of clear authority offered fertile ground for the consolidation of alternative powers. The process of Italian unification, known as the Risorgimento, was a political earthquake that radically changed the destiny of the South. In the middle of the 19th century, the armies led by Giuseppe Garibaldi landed in Sicily in what history remembers as the Expedition of the Thousand. With red flags, fiery speeches, and a promise of freedom, Garibaldi ignited the hope of peasants who saw in him the possibility of freeing themselves from the yoke of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, controlled by the Bourbons. However, the initial enthusiasm soon turned into disappointment. The unification did not bring the social justice that many expected. What came in its place was a centralized state with its seat first in Turin and later in Rome, incapable of understanding the particularities of the South and even less of offering solutions to the poverty that dominated the Sicilian villages. The arrival of new rulers did not change the reality of the peasants. The land remained in the hands of a few owners. Taxes increased and the state sent bureaucrats who were ignorant of local customs. The courts, supposedly modernized, were slow and ineffective. The police, seen as a foreign force, acted with brutality more than with justice. In that vacuum of trust, the clandestine networks that had already taken root on the island found a privileged space to strengthen themselves. The men of honor, who until then had operated as mediators in local disputes, began to play a more ambitious role, to become intermediaries between the population and the new state. In those turbulent years, the Mafia discovered that it could wear different disguises depending on the occasion. In front of the peasants, it presented itself as the defender of the dispossessed, the only force capable of guaranteeing a certain security amid the chaos. In front of the politicians newly arrived from the north, it presented itself as an indispensable ally, someone who knew the territory, who could guarantee order in areas where the government barely had a presence. In that way, the clans began to establish direct ties with the political class, offering favors in exchange for impunity. It was a silent but effective exchange, votes and social control in exchange for freedom of action. Electoral control became one of the most powerful weapons of the mafia groups. At a time when elections were beginning to gain ground as a symbol of modernity, the mafia learned to manipulate them with mastery. Through intimidation or through agreements with local bosses, it guaranteed the triumph of certain candidates, who in return committed themselves to closing their eyes to the activities of the clans. In this way, the honor and silence that had served to cement the organization in the rural sphere were transferred to the political arena, giving rise to a dangerous alliance that would mark the history of Italy for more than a century. This period is key because it marks the moment when the mafia ceased to be perceived only as a peasant phenomenon and began to become a power structure that penetrated the institutions of the state. The weakness of the new kingdom, incapable of imposing effective control throughout the territory, offered the clans an immense margin of maneuver. Where the law did not reach, the mafia imposed order. Where the authorities sought support, the mafia offered its backing. The result was a marriage of convenience between official power and clandestine power, which allowed the Sicilian chiefs to gain an influence they had never had until then. The expansion was not limited to the political sphere. The men of honor took advantage of the economic chaos generated by the unification to intervene in strategic sectors. The administration of expropriated lands, the protection of trade routes, and the surveillance of citrus crops, increasingly in demand in the international market, became sources of income and power. The gabalotti, those tenants of large tracts of land, found in the clans an ideal partner to keep the peasants subdued, who now not only worked under miserable conditions, but also had to obey the rules imposed by the armed guardians of the mafia. The myth of the man of honor was consolidated in this stage as an almost indispensable figure in Sicilian life. He was a judge, protector, businessman, and in many cases politician in the shadows. The peasants turned to him because they had no other choice. The landowners needed him to preserve their wealth. The politicians depended on him to win elections. The mafia had found the way to insert itself at all levels of society, and it did so with a discourse that mixed tradition, power, and pragmatism. The most disturbing aspect is that this process was not perceived as an anomaly, but as a natural evolution of the Sicilian order. People were accustomed to distrusting official power, and seeing in the clans a regulating force seemed almost logical. The practices of extortion and violence, although feared, were accepted as the price to pay for a certain stability. In the mentality of the time, the man of honor represented a lesser evil compared to the disorganization and arbitrariness of the state. At the same time, the mafia began to build an international network. The massive emigration of Sicilians to America carried with it the customs and codes of honor that had been born on the island. In cities such as New Orleans and New York, mafia nuclei began to form that reproduced, with greater or lesser success, the same system of protection, silence, and extortion. The unification of Italy, with its sequel of poverty and marginalization, had pushed thousands to seek fortune on other continents, and with them traveled the seed of a clandestine power that would soon expand beyond Sicily. In short, the unification of Italy did not represent a defeat for the mafia, as many would have expected, but rather an extraordinary opportunity to consolidate and multiply its influence. The clans demonstrated a remarkable capacity for adaptation. They knew how to move between the peasantry and politics, between the legal and the illegal, between local tradition and the modernity that the new state tried to impose. The result was an increasingly sophisticated organization, capable of surviving any change of regime, because it fed precisely on the weaknesses of the rulers. And while the tricolor flag waved in squares and official buildings as a symbol of the new Italian nation, in the dusty streets of Sicilian towns the true authority remained in the hands of the men of honor. They were the ones who dictated what could and could not be done, who could prosper and who had to be punished, who was inside the community and who was left out. The new state had arrived, yes, but in Sicily, the old codes still ruled. With the passing of the years, this mixture of tradition, political power, and economic ambitions would lay the foundations for an even greater expansion, in which the clans would begin to control entire sectors of the island's economy. The times of local disputes were being left behind, and what was looming was a mafioso power with increasingly broad interests and with an influence that could no longer be considered marginal. The first businesses: lemon, sulfur, and land. In Sicily, economic opportunities were always tied to the capricious nature of the island. For centuries, the land had been a source of wealth and, at the same time, the cause of endless disputes. But in the middle of the 19th century, With Italy newly unified and international trade expanding, some products acquired an unexpected and extraordinary value. Among them, the lemon, which in appearance was a humble fruit, turned into yellow gold thanks to the growing worldwide demand. The island, bathed in sunlight and with a climate ideal for citrus, became one of the main suppliers of lemons for England, France, and the United States. The juice and peel of the lemon were not only a culinary luxury, but also an effective remedy against scurvy, the disease that struck sailors on long voyages. The production of lemons multiplied rapidly, and with it came quick fortunes, but also conflicts. The orchards required constant vigilance, since the theft of fruit or entire trees could ruin entire seasons. In those plantations, the mafia clans found the perfect ground to extend their influence. The landowners hired armed men to guard the crops, and soon discovered that those guardians not only protected against common thieves, but could exercise a much greater power. Over the years, the mafia presence ceased to be an optional service and became a silent obligation. Without their protection, no producer could guarantee the safety of his investment. The lemon business, apparently so innocent, gave the mafia a stable and growing source of income. The clans collected money for protection, decided which producers could prosper, and controlled access to international markets. Through bribes and threats, they ensured that the export contracts passed through their hands. The yellow fruit that traveled on ships to London or New York carried behind it an invisible chain of extortion and social control. But citrus fruits were not the only natural treasure that Sicily offered to the men of honor. Beneath the surface of the island lay deposits of sulfur, a fundamental resource in the 19th century for the production of gunpowder, matches, and fertilizers. Italy became one of the largest exporters of sulfur in the world, and Sicily was its main source. The mines, however, were places of brutal exploitation, where children and adults worked in miserable conditions, descending into narrow and dangerous tunnels that claimed lives every day. In that underground world, the mafia found another opportunity to expand. The businessmen who managed the mines depended on the clans to guarantee the safe transport of the mineral, to protect it from looting, and to keep the workers under control. Strikes were crushed with violence, and any attempt at workers' organization was quickly destroyed. The mafiosi acted as intermediaries between the owners and the miners, but they did so by imposing a system of terror that kept both sides under their influence. Sulfur, so coveted by foreign powers, became a new source of power for the Sicilian families. If lemons and sulfur represented the visible and invisible wealth of the island, the land itself was the most disputed resource. For centuries, Sicily had been organized under a feudal system in which large estates belonged to aristocratic families, while peasants and laborers were limited to working under their control. With Italian unification and agrarian reforms, part of those lands passed into the hands of tenants, the so-called gabelotti, who in turn depended on overseers and armed men to maintain order in the fields. The mafia clans infiltrated this system so deeply that they soon became indispensable pieces. They controlled access to plots, imposed conditions on the peasants, and resolved disputes with a mixture of violence and negotiation. The landowners, distant and concerned with their own political interests, preferred to delegate management to men who knew how to impose respect. In this way, the mafia settled at the heart of the agricultural system, becoming the shadow that regulated everything. What is interesting about this stage is that mafia businesses were still not connected to openly illegal activities, as they would be in the future with smuggling and drug trafficking. Their power resided in their ability to insert themselves into legal sectors of the economy and control them from within. The lemon, the sulfur, and the land were not illegal in themselves, but around them was built a network of extortion, favors, and threats that transformed the clans into indisputable arbiters. They did not need to create clandestine markets, because the legitimate market itself was enough to generate fortunes, as long as they had the capacity to dominate it. The consolidation of these businesses gave the mafia an unprecedented stability. It was no longer only about small local groups that protected a village or a family. but about organizations that were beginning to accumulate capital, political influence, and international contacts. The money that flowed from citrus towards England, or from sulfur towards European factories, fed the coffers of the clans and allowed them to finance new networks of power. The Mafia, in less than a generation, had gone from being a secret society of men of honor to becoming a central economic actor on the island. As their economic power grew, so did their social influence. Mafia families began to invest in community life, organizing religious festivities, financing charitable works, and offering loans to peasants who could not go to banks. This mixture of interested generosity and relentless control reinforced their legitimacy. For many Sicilians, the Mafia was both a threat and a guarantee, a paradox that became part of everyday life. The control of lemons, sulfur, and land not only filled the coffers of the clans, but gave them something more valuable: respect. Respect not understood as moral admiration, but as that fearful recognition that forces one to obey and remain silent. With every orchard protected, with every shipment of sulfur escorted, with every land dispute resolved in favor of whoever paid, the mafiosi became the true lords of Sicily, gradually eclipsing the traditional aristocracy and the representatives of the state. Foreigners who traveled to the island were surprised by this system. They observed with astonishment that justice was not decided in courts, but in private meetings. That commercial agreements were not signed with ink, but with handshakes under the gaze of a local boss. That the authority of the carabinieri seemed weak compared to the word of a man respected by the community. For those who came from outside, it was almost incomprehensible that a fruit as delicate as the lemon, or a mineral as dangerous as sulfur, were guardians of a clandestine power that no one seemed capable of challenging. What was clear is that, by the end of the 19th century, the Mafia had managed to take root in the deepest part of the Sicilian economy. And it had done so without presenting itself as an open enemy of the state, but as an uncomfortable yet inevitable partner. While the peasants continued living in poverty, and while the politicians of the north congratulated themselves on unification, the clans built their own silent kingdom, nourished by the land and its fruits. This economic framework was the foundation upon which the darkest and best-known episodes of Mafia history would be built. Because once the clans understood that they could dominate entire sectors of the legitimate economy, they began to look with ambition at new opportunities that were not limited to agriculture or mining. The next step would be to use that power to influence politics directly and to consolidate a system of favors and threats that would reach the very heart of Italy. The first clash with the state, the Notarbartolo case. At the end of the 19th century, the Sicilian Mafia was no longer simply a network of local guardians or a scattered group of men who settled disputes in the villages. It had become an economic and social force that influenced politics, controlled strategic sectors, and had learned to move in the shadows with surprising efficiency. However, until that moment, for many Italians from the north, the Mafia was still a distant reality, a rumor that arrived from the island wrapped in stories of peasants, lemon groves, and armed overseers. Everything changed with a crime that shook public opinion and marked the first major open confrontation between the Italian state and the clandestine organization, the assassination of Emanuele Notarbartolo in the year 1893. Notarbartolo was not a simple peasant or just any landowner. He belonged to one of the most influential aristocratic families of Sicily and had been mayor of Palermo, in addition to holding a key position as general director of the Bank of Sicily, the most important financial institution on the island. A man of strong character and with a reputation for uncommon honesty in local politics, he had earned powerful enemies for his attempts to clean the bank of corrupt practices and confront the mafia interests that had already penetrated the administration. At a time when complicity between authorities and clans was the norm, Notarbartolo represented a dangerous obstacle for those who benefited from that system. On the 1st of February of the year 1893, Notarbartolo was traveling by train from Termini Imerese to Palermo. The journey was routine, one he had taken many times. But that afternoon he did not reach his destination. His body was found in the carriage, stabbed 27 times. A brutal crime that bore the unmistakable signature of a mafia execution. The murder shocked all of Italy, because it was not a feud among peasants or an act of rural banditry. It was a direct attack on a representative of the political and financial elite, someone too important for the state to simply look the other way. The investigation soon revealed what many had suspected. Behind the crime was the mafia, more specifically, the interests of clans tied to the control of the Bank of Sicily and the corruption networks that Notarbartolo had tried to dismantle. Among the main suspects was Raffaele Palizzolo, an influential politician from Palermo with deep connections both in local society and in mafia circles. The trial became a spectacle followed closely across all of Italy. For the first time, the mafia ceased to be a vague myth and became the protagonist of a national scandal. The trials, however, laid bare how difficult it was to confront an organization that not only used violence, but also relied on the complicity of politicians, judges, and witnesses willing to remain silent. The judicial process dragged on for years, with acquittals, appeals, and legal maneuvers that seemed designed to dilute the responsibility of the accused. Palizzolo was convicted at first, but later acquitted under suspicious circumstances, reinforcing the perception that the mafia was not just a group of criminals, but a parallel power capable of bending even the justice of the state. The Notarbartolo case was more than a murder. It was a mirror that forced Italy to look directly at the magnitude of the problem. Until then, many northern politicians had considered the mafia a regional matter, a kind of criminal folklore of the Sicilians that did not represent a real threat to the nation. But the death of a statesman on a train in the middle of the country's modernization made clear that the organization was capable of defying institutions and assassinating prominent figures without fear of consequences. The echo of this crime extended beyond Sicily. In the Italian parliament, the need for special measures to combat mafia infiltration was discussed, and some intellectuals began to write about the phenomenon, attempting to provide a theoretical framework to understand it. The mafia was described as a social cancer, a disease rooted in the political and economic fabric of the island, but one that threatened to spread if it was not firmly confronted. The national press reported on the judicial maneuvers and the impunity, feeding the idea that the state was weak against this clandestine force. The murder of Notarbartolo also had a profound cultural effect. From then on, the mafia began to be seen not only as a local problem, but as a threat to the very project of Italian unification. What good was it to build a modern state with railroads, banks, and parliaments if a group of armed men could assassinate a former mayor and bank director in a train carriage and get away with it? That question became an open wound for the young nation. However, despite the scandal and the outrage, the mafia emerged relatively strengthened. The trial demonstrated its ability to protect its allies, manipulate witnesses, and ensure that the truth was never fully known. For the clans, it was proof that they could challenge the state and continue operating with relative impunity. For the Sicilian population, it was confirmation of what they already knew, that the men of honor held more real power than the judges, and that official justice was a farce. The Notarbartolo case marked a before and after, crystallizing the public perception of the mafia as a power that could not be ignored. It showed clearly that the organization had gone from controlling lemon groves and sulfur mines to infiltrating banks and parliaments. It was a qualitative leap that revealed how the clans had transformed into political and economic actors of the highest order. The state, far from defeating them, seemed a prisoner of their networks of corruption. In retrospect, the assassination of Notarbartolo can be read as an early warning of what was to come in the following decades. A mafia increasingly emboldened, willing to eliminate any obstacle, any honest official, any judge who tried to break the chain of silence. What in the year 1893 seemed like an isolated crime would, over the years, become the prelude to a long history of attacks against magistrates, journalists, and politicians. At that moment, however, the prevailing feeling was one of impotence. The Italian state had been publicly challenged, and its response was lukewarm, slow, and ultimately ineffective. The clans learned that they could play with judicial delays, corrupt officials, and maintain the loyalty of their men through fear and prestige. Society resigned, accepted that facing the mafia was useless, and that resignation was perhaps the greatest triumph the men of honor could achieve. Thus, as the 19th century came to a close, the mafia was more consolidated than ever. It had proven that it could act with violence, control the economy, and manipulate politics, all under the cloak of silence that protected it. And while the Italian nation tried to assert itself as a modern country, Sicily remained trapped in a web where the law of the state and the law of the clans coexisted in a fragile and perverse balance. The leap to America, the mafia diaspora. At the end of the 19th century, Sicily was immersed in a crisis that seemed endless. The land was not enough to feed everyone, taxes were disproportionate, and the opportunities for social advancement were practically non-existent for the majority of peasants and workers. Thousands of families looked to the horizon with the hope of finding in other lands what the island denied them: bread, work, and a less uncertain future. Thus began one of the greatest migrations in modern history, with ships departing crowded from Palermo, Messina, or Naples bound for America, carrying in their holds not only improvised suitcases and weary faces, but also customs, codes of honor, and silences inherited from generations. Among those emigrants traveled men who had grown up under the influence of the mafia clans in Sicily. Some were simple peasants seeking fortune. Others were young men who had served as men of respect in their villages and who knew how to impose discipline. And a few were already figures with broader ambitions who understood, before anyone else, that the New World offered opportunities that Sicily could never provide. The diaspora thus became a vehicle for the mafia to cross the ocean and find in American soil a fertile ground in which to root its methods. The main destination for many Sicilians was the United States of America. New Orleans, New York, and Chicago became the epicenters of that migration. In New Orleans, for example, the Italian community grew rapidly, concentrating in poor neighborhoods where poverty and discrimination were part of daily life. There, the newly arrived grouped themselves around family and regional ties, replicating the same structure of solidarity and mistrust that they knew from the island. Very soon, the first reports appeared of Italian gangs operating in the port, controlling markets and using extortion as a mechanism of power. One of the most remembered episodes occurred in the year 1890, when the police chief of New Orleans was assassinated under circumstances that pointed directly to the Sicilian Mafia. The case provoked a wave of hatred against Italian immigrants and resulted in a massive lynching of suspects, an episode of collective violence that reflected the extent to which the presence of these groups generated fear and rejection. However, popular repression was not enough to eliminate the mafia. On the contrary, it reinforced the internal cohesion of the clans and allowed them to present themselves as protectors of their own community in the face of a hostile environment. In New York, the story took an even more decisive course. The neighborhoods of Little Italy in Manhattan began to become a refuge for Sicilian immigrants, and in their narrow streets flourished businesses, churches, and associations. But in the same measure in which the community grew, networks of extortion also consolidated. Shops and restaurants paid fees to the so-called black handers, groups that sent threatening letters with drawings of black hands and skulls, demanding money under threat of death. Although these practices were not always organized directly by the traditional Sicilian Mafia, they often served as the prelude to something larger, a permanent system of control and intimidation that would give birth to the Cosa Nostra on American soil. Chicago, for its part, would later receive figures who would make history. Although at the beginning Sicilians there mixed with other immigrant communities in small-scale activities, the city, with its explosive growth and voracious black market, would become an ideal setting for the expansion of clans that understood how to take advantage of the system's weaknesses. What in Sicily had begun as the protection of lemon groves and sulfur mines in America was transformed into the control of bars, clandestine gambling, and labor unions. It is important to understand that the Mafia did not arrive in the United States of America with a master plan already designed. It did not disembark with a structure ready to operate like a multinational crime corporation. What occurred was a gradual process in which Sicilian customs of honor, silence, and clandestine mediation found fertile ground in urban societies where institutions were weak in immigrant neighborhoods and where the police were often more concerned with controlling appearances than with protecting the newly arrived. The discrimination against Italians, treated as second-class citizens, reinforced the need to group together in closed communities where trust was granted only to those who shared origin and codes. In this breeding ground, the mafiosi knew how to adapt. They began by controlling local markets, then extended their influence to municipal politics, offering block votes to candidates willing to look the other way, and finally understood that the true power lay in dominating the illegal businesses that flourished in the cities. Gambling, prostitution, and alcohol trafficking in the years prior to Prohibition were the first steps of a meteoric rise. The Sicilian Mafia soon connected with other criminal organizations. In New York, the Italian gangs began to cross paths with Irish and Jewish groups, generating alliances and conflicts that would shape a complex underworld. What is interesting is that, while those gangs tended to be violent and disorganized, the Sicilians contributed something different. A hierarchical structure inspired by the island's clans, an unbreakable code of silence, and a discipline that, in the long term, gave them an advantage over their competitors. The Mafia diaspora also had a two-way effect. The men who emigrated to America sent money to Sicily, strengthening their families and clans of origin. In some cases, the bosses themselves traveled back and forth, maintaining connections between the island and the American continent. That transatlantic network allowed the movement of capital, people, and influence, and transformed the Mafia into a phenomenon no longer just regional but international. In a short time, the Mafia presence in America went from being a curiosity of immigrant neighborhoods to becoming a true problem for the local authorities. Newspapers began to speak of the Black Hand, of murders in broad daylight, of intimidated judges, and of corrupt politicians. The figure of the mafioso became enveloped in an aura of mystery and threat, and at the same time began to generate a strange respect. Among their own, they were seen as someone who had triumphed in a hostile world, someone capable of imposing order where everything was chaos. This leap to America was decisive because it allowed the Mafia to escape the limitations of the island. In Sicily, no matter how much power it accumulated, it always had to negotiate with landowners, politicians, and a state that, although weak, still existed. In the United States of America, on the other hand, it found a practically virgin terrain, with millions of poor and desperate immigrants, with corruptible authorities, and with a booming economy that opened doors to both legal and illegal businesses. There, the Mafia discovered that it could become an empire. What in the year 1893 seemed like an isolated crime in Sicily, such as the assassination of Notar Bartolo in America, was transformed into a network of power that grew without anyone knowing how to stop it. The dream of prosperity that pushed the immigrants mixed with the nightmare of an organization that knew how to take advantage of the shortcomings of a young and transforming country. And in that crossing of hopes and threats was born a new stage of Mafia history, a stage that would forever change the perception of organized crime throughout the world. The Mafia in the era of Prohibition. The decade of 1920 transformed forever the history of the Mafia in the United States. The entire country launched itself into a social and moral experiment that aimed to eradicate one of the oldest vices of humanity, alcohol. With Prohibition, which prohibited the production, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages, the government believed it would succeed in shaping a healthier, more productive, more disciplined society. What they did not foresee was that by closing the doors of legal bars and distilleries, They were opening wide a golden path for organized crime, and no one knew how to take advantage of it with as much cunning and brutality as the mafia. Prohibition turned alcohol into the most coveted product in the country. The demand did not disappear. On the contrary, it multiplied. Millions of Americans, from working-class neighborhoods to the salons of the elites, continued to desire whiskey, wine, or beer, and were willing to pay whatever was necessary to obtain it. That overwhelming demand created a gigantic black market, and the mafia clans, who until then had focused on local extortion, illegal gambling, or neighborhood control, understood that they had before them a unique opportunity to enrich themselves and expand as never before. The smuggling of alcohol became the backbone of the new American mafia. The clans organized transport routes from Canada and the Caribbean, set up clandestine distilleries in basements and warehouses, and established a network of secret bars, the famous speakeasies, where politicians, police officers, and ordinary citizens drank in the shadows to the rhythm of jazz. Those clandestine establishments multiplied by the thousands in cities such as New York, Chicago, and Detroit, and behind every bar, behind every hidden bottle, was the invisible hand of the mobsters. Money began to flow in unimaginable amounts. The profits were so enormous that they allowed the clans to buy wills, bribe judges, recruit armies of thugs, and finance a criminal machine without precedent. With alcohol, the mafia ceased to be seen as a problem of immigrants in poor neighborhoods and became a power that openly defied the state. The newspapers spoke of murders in broad daylight, of wars between rival gangs, of corpses found in cars and alleys, scenes that fueled both fear and fascination. Chicago became the bloodiest and most emblematic stage of this era. There, a young man of Neapolitan origin named Alphonse Capone, known as Al Capone, went from being a small-time thug to becoming the undisputed king of illegal alcohol. His empire extended throughout the city, controlling hundreds of secret bars and collecting millions of dollars each year. Capone was not only a criminal, he was a symbol of the era. Impeccable suit, fedora hat, defiant smile, and an ability to move between brutal violence and corrupt politics that made him untouchable. The war for the control of alcohol in Chicago reached levels of barbarity that left a mark on collective memory. Rival gangs disputed distribution routes with gunfire, and every week new dead appeared in the streets. The most famous episode of that violence was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, when 7 men from the gang of George Bugs Moran were gunned down with machine guns in a garage by Capone's hitmen. The image of the bodies lined up against the wall, riddled with bullets, became a symbol of the reign of terror imposed by the mafia. But the story of Prohibition was not only that of Capone in Chicago. In New York, the Italian clans fought their own battles. Figures such as Giuseppe Joe the Boss, Masseria, and Salvatore Maranzano led organizations that disputed control of the city. The business of clandestine alcohol was so lucrative that no one was willing to give up territory, and the streets of Manhattan and Brooklyn filled with confrontations, betrayals, and murders. From those wars emerged characters such as Charles Lucky Luciano, who later would transform the structure of the American mafia, but who in those years was beginning to make a name for himself amid the chaos. Prohibition demonstrated the capacity of the mafia to adapt to historical circumstances and to exploit the contradictions of the system. While the government insisted on imposing morality through law, the entire society plunged into a sea of hypocrisy, drinking in secret bars while looking the other way at the violence that sustained that market. The mobsters understood that their strength did not lie only in weapons, but in their ability to offer what people desired, even if the law prohibited it. Illegal alcohol became, ultimately, a business that gave them economic power and social legitimacy. Because, although the press portrayed them as murderers, for many citizens they were also providers of entertainment, of escape, of a luxury they were not willing to renounce. The speakeasies became fashionable places where artists, businessmen, and politicians shared drinks without asking too many questions about the origin of the whiskey. That tacit complicity between society and organized crime was one of the great legacies of Prohibition. The end of Prohibition in 1933 did not mean the end of the Mafia, but rather its consolidation. For more than a decade, the clans had accumulated fortunes, bought wills, and built international smuggling networks that did not disappear overnight. On the contrary, those structures served as a base for new illegal businesses, from gambling to drugs. The Mafia had learned to think big, to organize itself like a modern criminal enterprise, and nothing would ever be the same again. The era of Prohibition was, in short, the laboratory where the American Mafia became a giant. There it perfected its methods of extortion, consolidated its hierarchies, experimented with political control, and demonstrated that it could challenge an entire country without being destroyed. What began as an attempt by the government to moralize society ended up being the definitive impulse for organized crime to become one of the most powerful forces of the 20th century. And while in the United States the echo of gunfire and clandestine battles marked the decade, in distant Sicily, the clans continued watching attentively, aware that the violence of Chicago and New York was, in a way, the magnified reflection of what they themselves had built in their native island. History, however, still had unexpected twists reserved for both sides of the Atlantic. Mussolini against the Mafia. Italy at the beginning of the 20th century was marked by political, social, and economic tensions that seemed impossible to resolve. The Great War had left deep wounds. Poverty continued to dominate wide regions of the South, and the state, despite decades of attempts, was unable to impose solid authority in territories where the Mafia continued to reign under its own codes. It was in this context of uncertainty and disorder that Benito Mussolini rose to power, promising discipline, order, and a strong Italy capable of recovering its lost glory. And among the many enemies that his regime swore to destroy, the Sicilian Mafia occupied a prominent place. Mussolini saw in the Mafia not only a criminal problem, but also a direct challenge to the authority of the fascist state. For a dictator obsessed with absolute control, the existence of a parallel power that was governed by its own laws and enjoyed the loyalty of thousands of Sicilians was intolerable. Fascism needed to demonstrate that it could impose itself even in the most rebellious corners of the nation, and Sicily was the perfect stage to display that victory. It was then that a key figure appeared on the scene: Cesare Mori, the Iron Prefect. Mori was a man of inflexible character, convinced that violence had to be fought with more violence, and that the only way to break Mafia power was to suffocate it without hesitation. In 1925, Mussolini appointed him prefect of Palermo and granted him extraordinary, practically unlimited powers to confront the clans. Mori interpreted that mission with almost religious fervor. He organized massive raids in entire towns, deployed troops in rural villages, surrounded houses, arrested suspects, and subjected them to relentless interrogations. In less than a decade, thousands of Sicilians were arrested under suspicion of ties to the Mafia. Mori's tactics were brutal and direct. He did not hesitate to besiege entire towns until the inhabitants handed over hidden mafiosi, nor to use the families of suspects as pressure to obtain confessions. Many of those arrested had never had a direct relationship with the Mafia, but they were imprisoned anyway under the pretext of breaking the law of silence. The courts, under the fascist regime, prosecuted the accused without much legal guarantee. The message was clear: no one was safe if they defied the state. The results, at least in appearance, were surprising. In just a few years, the Mafia suffered a devastating blow. Many bosses were sent to prison, others fled abroad, and many chose to hide, reducing their activities to a minimum. The Sicilian population, terrified by the raids, began to speak of the Mafia in a low voice, as if it were a ghost that had lost its strength. Mussolini seized the opportunity to proclaim that his regime had achieved what no previous government had managed: to defeat the Mafia and restore order in Sicily. However, the reality was more complex. Mori's repression weakened the clans, but it did not destroy their roots. The mafia survived, although underground, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Fascism, with its hunger for propaganda, confused silence with disappearance. It believed that the men of honor had been annihilated, when in reality many had simply learned to hide better, to wait for the opportune moment. The regime had managed to control appearances, but the seed of the mafia remained alive in the communities, in the families, in that invisible web of loyalties that neither prison nor violence could eradicate. In addition, Mori's method had dangerous side effects. By applying indiscriminate repression, the prefect generated resentment among the population. Many Sicilians began to see the fascist state as a foreign force that acted with the same brutality that they had previously reproached in the invaders. That perception reinforced, in the long run, sympathy for the mafia clans, which appeared as victims of an authoritarian power more interested in propaganda than in justice. Hatred towards Rome deepened, and the idea that the mafiosi were the true representatives of the community survived beneath the surface. The most significant impact of Mori's campaign was not the destruction of the mafia, but its displacement. Many mafiosi fled to the United States, where they found an ideal refuge in the networks already established by the diaspora. In cities like New York or Chicago, the arrival of experienced men strengthened the organization of the clans and gave them a direct connection with Sicily. Paradoxically, Mussolini's repression helped to consolidate the internationalization of the mafia, which in the following decades would become a global phenomenon. The fascist regime, obsessed with displaying its strength, proclaimed for years that the mafia had been defeated. Newspapers published stories of successful raids, squares filled with triumphant speeches, and local authorities repeated the official version that Sicily was finally pacified. But the fall of fascism and the arrival of the Second World War were enough to reveal the truth. The mafia was still there, intact in its roots, waiting for the right moment to regain lost ground. The figure of Cesare Mori was surrounded by the ambiguity of great historical characters. For some, he was a hero, a man who faced with courage a feared enemy and who managed to reduce its power like no one before him. For others, he was an instrument of fascism, a repressor who used brutal methods and who confused immediate results with lasting solutions. The truth is that his campaign marked a decisive moment in the history of the mafia. For the first time, the Italian state had deployed a serious and systematic offensive against the clans, proving that it was possible to corner them. The lesson, however, remained incomplete. Mussolini underestimated the mafia's capacity for adaptation and believed in the illusion of a total victory. The organization, weakened but not destroyed, learned to survive in the shadows, to wait patiently, and to weave new networks that would once again be activated when the storm had passed. History would show, in the following decades, that the mafia was much more resilient than the fascists had imagined. And when the cannons of war began to roar and foreign troops set their eyes on Sicily, the men of honor understood that the time had come to step into the light once again. The Second World War and the pact with the Allies. When fascism seemed to have reduced the mafia to a distant memory, world history took such an unexpected turn that it returned the Sicilian clans to a privileged place on the board of power. The Second World War transformed life throughout Europe, and Sicily, because of its strategic location in the Mediterranean, became a key stage of military operations. There, on that island punished by centuries of domination and marked by the shadow of fascism, the mafia found the perfect occasion to resurface, supported by nothing less than the most powerful army on the planet, the Army of the United States. In the year 1943, the Allies were preparing for the invasion of Italy. The campaign in North Africa had concluded successfully, and the next step was to open a front in Europe in order to weaken Mussolini's regime and move closer to the heart of Germany. Sicily was the perfect entry point. Its geographic position allowed control of Mediterranean routes, and the establishment of bases from which to attack the peninsula. But the island was also a difficult terrain, with steep mountains, towns hostile to central power, and a population that had suffered fascist repression for years. In this context, American intelligence services began to look for local contacts who could facilitate the invasion. And it was then that they turned their eyes toward the Sicilian emigrants who, decades earlier, had settled in cities like New York, and who, in many cases, were linked to the Mafia. The names of mafiosi such as Lucky Luciano began to appear in secret reports from the Navy and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Luciano, imprisoned for crimes related to prostitution, was seen as an ideal intermediary to guarantee the cooperation of the Sicilian clans. From his cell, he negotiated with the American authorities an agreement that remained secret for years. In exchange for judicial benefits, Luciano committed himself to facilitating the collaboration of mafiosi both in American ports and in Sicily itself. The ports were fundamental for the war effort. In New York, the threat of German sabotage was real, and the Mafia, which controlled dock workers' unions, could guarantee that military operations would take place without interruptions. Luciano and other bosses gave instructions to their men to collaborate with the authorities, avoiding strikes and ensuring that ships departed on time. It was a pragmatic pact. The Allies obtained security in their logistical operations, and the Mafia obtained recognition and promises of leniency. The decisive moment arrived with Operation Husky, the Allied landing in Sicily in July of 1943. British and American troops invaded the island, confronting German resistance and fascist forces. But in many towns they encountered a surprising reception. Part of that favorable welcome was due to the population's weariness with Mussolini's regime, but it was also due to the influence of the Mafia clans, who had been instructed to collaborate with the invaders. In several localities, local mafiosi acted as guides, interpreters, and mediators, facilitating the Allied advance. One of the most emblematic cases was that of Calogero Vizzini, known as Don Calò, a mafia boss of great prestige in the region of Villalba. During the invasion, Vizzini was seen riding in an Allied jeep, greeting the inhabitants and presenting himself as the new local political reference. His figure became a symbol of the Mafia's rebirth. From being persecuted under fascism, he passed to being an ally of the forces that liberated Sicily. The Allies, in need of order and of leaders capable of controlling the population, appointed several mafiosi as provisional mayors in different towns. The legitimacy that these men obtained thanks to Allied uniforms consolidated their power in a fulminant way. The irony of history is evident. While fascism had proclaimed its victory over the Mafia with brutal methods, the armies that defeated fascism returned prestige and power to it. The population, which had learned to distrust the state, once again saw the clans as the natural intermediaries between the community and the authorities. The mafiosi, as shrewd as always, knew how to capitalize on that role, presenting themselves as patriots collaborating in the liberation of Italy, when in reality they sought to recover their lost influence. The impact of the pact between the Allies and the Mafia extended beyond the end of the war. During the post-war period, many of the men who had collaborated with the American military retained local political positions, infiltrating the nascent Italian Republic. Mafia power was reconfigured, leaving behind fascist repression and adapting to a new era in which democratic politics offered infinite opportunities for influence. The clans linked themselves with political parties, above all with Christian democracy, which dominated Italian politics for decades. The tacit agreement with the Allies also reinforced transatlantic ties. The relationship between the Sicilian mafias and the American ones, which already existed thanks to the diaspora, was strengthened as never before. The clans of New York and Chicago maintained direct contact with Sicily, sharing businesses, strategies, and in many cases, people who traveled back and forth across the ocean. This connection would be crucial in the later development of drug trafficking, which found in Sicily a natural bridge to introduce drugs into Europe and America. In the long term, the collaboration between the Mafia and the Allies left an ambiguous legacy. For some historians, it was a pragmatic decision in times of war. The military needed quick results, and the clans offered a local network impossible to match. For others, it was a historical mistake that strengthened a criminal organization at a moment when it could have been definitively dismantled. What is certain is that, after the war, the Mafia not only survived, but came out reinforced, with renewed prestige and a strategic position in the politics and economy of the island. The Second World War was, in this sense, a turning point. The Mafia demonstrated that it was capable of resisting even a totalitarian regime, of surviving in secrecy, and of resurging with strength by allying itself with the new victors. It was the confirmation that the Sicilian clans were not a simple gang of criminals, but an organization with an extraordinary capacity for adaptation, capable of surviving any regime, any war, any crisis. And while Europe was being rebuilt among ruins, the mafiosi were already thinking about the future, about how to expand their businesses beyond the Sicilian villages, and how to take advantage of post-war modernity to multiply their power. The war had given them a second life, and they were determined not to waste it. The rise in the United States. When the Second World War ended and the Sicilian Mafia regained strength on the island, on the other side of the Atlantic, the Italian-American clans were reaching the peak of their power. What had begun with poor immigrants in the slums of New York and New Orleans had been transformed, after the experience of Prohibition, into an organization capable of moving millions of dollars, infiltrating politics, and projecting its shadow over the entire United States. It was a criminal empire with well-defined hierarchies, codes of silence, and an ambition that knew no limits. But the most fascinating aspect is that, in the midst of this violent and clandestine world, the idea arose to create a governing body, a sort of parliament of crime, that would regulate disputes, avoid bloody wars, and manage the illegal business as if it were a multinational company. That body would become known as the Commission. The driving force behind this transformation was Charles "Lucky" Luciano, one of the most influential mobsters in history. The son of Sicilian immigrants, Luciano had grown up on the tough streets of New York, where he learned to navigate between gangs and clandestine businesses. During Prohibition, he consolidated himself as a shrewd and calculating boss, capable of seeing beyond street fights and of understanding that the future of the Mafia did not lie in endless wars, but in cooperation among clans. After surviving the so-called Castellamarese War, a brutal confrontation between the factions of Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano in the 1930s, Luciano reorganized the Mafia of New York into 5 major families: Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo. Each one would have its own territory, its own structure, and its own boss, but all would be coordinated under the supervision of the Commission. The Commission functioned like a board of directors. Its meetings brought together the leaders of the principal families who discussed business, resolved disputes, and approved strategic decisions. No one could kill a boss without the authorization of this body, which reduced the risk of bloody wars that would attract too much attention from the police. The idea was simple but revolutionary: to transform organized crime into an orderly system, with clear rules and a balance of power that allowed everyone to become rich without destroying each other. The consolidation of the Commission coincided with a stage of economic expansion in the United States. The end of Prohibition had closed the business of illegal alcohol, but it had opened a world of new opportunities: gambling, unions, drugs, and above all, gaming in Las Vegas. The desert city of Nevada, which in the decade of the 1940s was little more than a handful of improvised casinos, became the perfect laboratory for the Mafia to build a visible and glamorous empire, disguised as the entertainment industry. Las Vegas offered what no other city could: legality in gambling, a favorable legal framework, and a territory where almost everything still had to be built. It was there that mobsters such as Meyer Lansky, ally of Luciano and financial brain of crime, saw the opportunity to launder entire fortunes by building hotels, casinos, and shows. Money flowed from New York, Chicago, and Miami to Nevada, financing projects that combined luxury, fun, and corruption. Hotels such as the Flamingo, inaugurated by the charismatic and reckless Bugsy Siegel, became symbols of this new stage. Behind its bright lights and red carpets, the Mafia controlled every gaming table, every bet, every dollar that passed through the roulette wheel. The system was ingenious. The casinos generated millions in profits, but a substantial part of that money never appeared in the accounting books. It was the so-called skim, the slice that the mobsters took before declaring official revenues. That money traveled back to the families of New York and Chicago, financing new illegal businesses, buying political will, and feeding the criminal machine. Las Vegas became a kind of paradise where the illegal and the legal blended so perfectly that it was almost impossible to distinguish where the legitimate business ended and where the Mafia's shadow began. The rise of Las Vegas coincided with a profound cultural change in the United States. The Mafia, which during the years of Prohibition had been seen as a bloody threat, began to acquire an aura of glamour. Movies, newspapers, and magazines spoke of bosses like Capone, Luciano, or Siegel with a mixture of fear and fascination. The casinos were frequented by Hollywood stars, politicians, and businessmen who, many times without knowing, or pretending not to know, shared cocktails and gaming tables with mobsters. Popular culture was beginning to transform criminals into legends, into almost romantic figures who seemed to embody both the American dream and its darkest side. The Commission knew how to take advantage of this duality. While in public they presented themselves as businessmen and philanthropists, in private they continued to run an empire based on extortion, smuggling, and violence. Murders did not disappear, but they became more calculated, less visible. The Mafia had learned that discretion was as powerful as bullets, and that true success resided in controlling the flow of money more than in displaying force. The power achieved during this era was so great that even entire unions, such as the Teamsters under the leadership of Jimmy Hoffa, came under Mafia influence. Controlling transport meant controlling the movement of goods throughout the country, and that gave the clans a capacity for pressure that no politician could ignore. The line that separated the state from the Mafia became increasingly blurred, with judges, mayors, and congressmen benefiting directly or indirectly from the network of favors and bribes woven by the bosses. The rise of the Commission and the splendor of Las Vegas marked the golden age of the Mafia in the United States. Never before had it possessed so much power, so much wealth, and so much influence. It was an empire built on violence, but disguised with elegant suits, luxurious casinos, and shows of lights. The organization had learned to speak the language of modernity, to present itself as part of progress, when in reality it was still a clandestine power operating in the shadows. However, that same expansion sowed the seeds of the conflicts to come. Because the larger the empire became, the more difficult it was to maintain loyalty and silence. The Mafia families grew rich, yes, but they also began to compete for the control of territories and businesses. And in the meantime, the North American state, which for decades had tolerated the existence of the clans, was beginning to understand that this parallel power could become too great a threat to ignore. The Golden Age was underway, but like every era of splendor, it concealed within its lights the germ of its own decline. Sicily in the 1950s. The post-war years brought to Sicily a completely new scenario. After the defeat of fascism and the Allied landing, the island was marked by a double paradox. On the one hand, it was a territory devastated by war, poor, with minimal infrastructure and a fragmented social fabric. On the other hand, a horizon of opportunities opened up as had not been seen in centuries, because the Italian state and the United States were determined to invest in reconstruction, and enormous amounts of money began to flow into modernization projects. That sudden abundance, combined with the structural weakness of the state, and the historic strength of the clans allowed the mafia to reinvent itself and become a central political and economic actor in Sicilian life. The decades of the 1950s and 1960s were the years of the Italian economic miracle, and although Sicily still lagged behind the industrial north, it received a significant portion of the resources allocated for roads, housing, and public works. Cities began to transform. New neighborhoods were built in Palermo, Catania, and Messina. Dams were constructed, and plans for agricultural modernization were designed. But in every contract, in every tender, in every brick, the shadow of the mafia appeared, which had learned from the American experience and now saw in construction a source of wealth as great as citrus smuggling or the control of sulfur mines had been in the past. The so-called Sack of Palermo is one of the most revealing episodes of this stage. During the 1950s and 1960s, the Sicilian capital experienced uncontrolled urban expansion, with the destruction of historic villas, gardens, and palaces to make way for hastily built, low-quality apartment blocks. Thousands of building permits were irregularly granted thanks to collusion between local politicians, construction businessmen, and mafia families. The clans ensured that the works were carried out without interference, intimidated rivals who tried to compete, and guaranteed themselves a share of the profits. Palermo changed its face in just a few years, but its new appearance was not a symbol of modernity, but of corruption and rampant speculation. The mafia found in construction more than just money. It found a way to consolidate its political power. Controlling urban development meant controlling the daily lives of thousands of people, from the worker on the construction site to the family that bought an apartment built with cheap cement and false permits. The clans became indispensable mediators between the population and the state, because nothing could be done without their tacit approval. Politicians, for their part, accepted this reality because they needed votes, and in Sicily, votes were secured thanks to the mafia's ability to mobilize entire neighborhoods. At the same time that construction was transforming the cities, another clandestine business kept the clan's economy alive: cigarette smuggling. During the 1950s, tobacco became a mass consumption product in Europe, but fiscal policies made it expensive. Sicily, with its strategic position in the Mediterranean, became a key point for introducing illegal shipments coming from North African countries. Fast boats crossed the sea under the cover of night, unloaded boxes in small coves, and from there, the cigarettes were distributed throughout Italy and the rest of the continent. Smuggling not only generated enormous economic profits, but also reinforced the image of the mafia as an invulnerable power, capable of defying maritime authorities and maintaining a logistical network that surpassed the capacities of the state. Moreover, it allowed the clans to strengthen ties with other criminal groups abroad, laying the groundwork for much more lucrative international businesses in the future, such as the heroin trade that would dominate the following decades. The mafia's power in the 1950s was not limited to the economic sphere. It was also direct political power. In those years, the Christian democracy consolidated itself as the dominant party in Italy, and in Sicily it found a strategic ally in the clans. The mafiosi secured votes en masse, pressured communities to support certain candidates, and in exchange received judicial protection, public contracts, and the peace of mind of being able to operate without major interference. This relationship of mutual convenience turned the mafia into a disguised political actor without the need to occupy parliamentary seats, because it controlled from the shadows those who did. Mafia influence even extended to the daily lives of the most humble Sicilians. The clans controlled markets, transportation, jobs in construction, and even the granting of favors as simple as obtaining an administrative permit. For the population, turning to a mafia boss was faster and more effective than going to the state offices, where bureaucracy and corruption slowed down any procedure. In this way, the mafia reinforced its role as a parallel power, an alternative authority that offered solutions in exchange for obedience and silence. The post-war period also witnessed a generational change within the clans. Old bosses who had survived fascism gave way to a new wave of mafiosi, who were more ambitious and less willing to limit themselves to local control. These young men understood that wealth was not only in land and construction, but also in opening doors to global markets, establishing contacts with the United States, and diversifying activities. That change marked the beginning of a more violent stage, in which internal disputes would leave corpses in the streets and the mafia would lose part of the discretion that had characterized the old men of honor. But in the 1950s and 1960s, the prevailing feeling was that the mafia had found the perfect formula: money from construction, profits from smuggling, and political backing. While the Italian state proclaimed progress and modernity, in Sicily, true modernization was being carried out under the shadow of the clans. Cement, tobacco, and politics were the new pillars of a power that seemed indestructible. With every building erected, with every shipment of cigarettes unloaded, with every vote secured, the mafia deepened its roots in Sicilian life. And although on the surface everything seemed like a process of economic growth, in the background the stage was being set for one of the bloodiest periods in mafia history, the one in which the clans would launch themselves into competing for the most profitable business of the century: drugs. The years of lead, drug trafficking, and bloody wars. At the end of the 1960s and during the following 2 decades, the Sicilian Mafia entered a phase that would change its history forever. Cigarette smuggling and control of the construction industry, which had once been reliable sources of wealth, began to be seen as minor businesses compared to the gigantic market that was emerging with force in the world. Drug trafficking. Heroin became the white gold, a product of extremely high demand in the United States and Europe, with profit margins so enormous that any clan involved in its trafficking could become rich in a matter of months. It was a temptation impossible to resist, and the massive entry of the mafia into this business not only made it more powerful, but also more violent, because the magnitude of the profits generated internal divisions and unprecedented wars. Sicily occupied a privileged place within this global network. Due to its geographic position, it functioned as a natural bridge between the opium-producing countries of the Middle East and the consumers in the West. The Sicilian clans established contacts with Turkish, Lebanese, and Marseille traffickers, and turned the island into a center of heroin refining and distribution. In clandestine laboratories, hidden in the hills or in apparently harmless farms, tons of drugs were processed and later shipped to the United States through well-established routes. The so-called pizza connection is one of the most famous episodes of this stage. During the 1970s, dozens of pizzerias in New York and other American cities were used as fronts to distribute Sicilian heroin. The system was as simple as it was brilliant. Drug shipments arrived camouflaged in food containers, were stored in innocent-looking premises, and from there were distributed to the street distribution network. The business generated hundreds of millions of dollars annually, turning the clans of Palermo and Corleone into authentic multinational corporations of crime. But such a volume of money had a price. The internal unity of the mafia was broken. Traditional families, accustomed to discretion and local control, looked with distrust at the emerging clans that bet everything on drug trafficking. The old guard feared that the exposure and violence associated with drugs would attract excessive attention from the state, endangering the survival of the organization. On the other hand, the new leaders, such as Toto Riina and Bernardo Provenzano, saw in heroin a historic opportunity to break the dominance of Palermo and place the Corleonesi at the top of mafia power. Thus began one of the bloodiest wars in the history of Cosa Nostra. The 1970s and 80s were marked by chain assassinations, ambushes, and attacks that filled the streets with corpses. Rival clans were eliminated without mercy, and the violence reached not only mafiosi but also judges, prosecutors, police officers, and politicians who dared to challenge the Corleonesi. Riina, nicknamed the Beast, established a reign of terror in which the logic was simple. Whoever did not obey died. The Mafia war had its epicenter in Palermo, but its effects extended throughout Sicily. The population lived in fear, with car bombs exploding in the middle of the street, with bullet-ridden corpses on the corners, with funerals multiplying week after week. The Mafia, which for decades had cultivated an image of discreet and almost paternal authority, transformed into a machine of death that spread fear even among those who had once revered it as mediator and protector. Meanwhile, the profits from drug trafficking reached colossal figures. Money circulated in suitcases full of bills, invested in hotels, restaurants, Swiss banks, and front companies. The infiltration into the legal economy was so deep that it was almost impossible to separate the clean from the dirty. The Corleonesi understood that violence was necessary to consolidate power, but that the true legacy of their dominance lay in the accumulation of capital, in financial control that assured them influence beyond the borders of Sicily. The Italian state did not remain indifferent, although for years its efforts were weak and fragmented. There was complicity from certain political sectors and widespread fear among officials. However, as the violence intensified, figures began to emerge willing to confront the Mafia with unprecedented determination. Judges such as Cesare Terranova, Rocco Cinici, and later Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino became symbols of resistance, although many of them paid with their lives. The heroin war was not only between clans, it was also a war against the Italian state. The brutality of the years of lead left an indelible mark on Sicilian society. Families mourned their dead, businesses closed out of fear of extortion. Young people grew up with the certainty that the future was marked by the law of the strongest. And yet, in the midst of that dark climate, a civil consciousness was also born that would later bear fruit in the form of anti-mafia movements and pressure for the state to act firmly. Drug trafficking turned the Mafia into an unprecedented economic power, but it also exposed it like never before. The internal wars made its mechanisms of power visible, and the subsequent trials began to reveal the scope of its international networks. The 1970s and 80s were a time of colossal wealth and extreme violence, a period in which Sicily became the world epicenter of organized crime. Heroin had changed the rules of the game, and with it had come both prosperity and destruction. The price of unbridled ambition would be, sooner or later, a reaction from the state and from society that would mark the beginning of a new chapter in the history of the Mafia. The Mafia and politics. Connections in the shadows. If in the post-war years the Mafia had secured a discreet seat within local institutions, in the following decades, its influence reached such heights that it began to affect the balance of national politics in Italy. The money from drug trafficking and construction was not only used to enrich the clans, it was also the fuel with which they oiled the machinery of political power, bought favors, ensured impunity, and most importantly, guaranteed that their businesses continued to grow without obstacles. To speak about the Mafia in the 1970s and 1980s cannot be done without also speaking about the Christian Democracy Party, which dominated Italy during the Cold War, and found in Sicily one of its strongest electoral strongholds thanks to the support of the clans. Votes were the most valuable commodity in a region where poverty remained a constant and where thousands of families depended on the favors they could obtain through Mafia intermediaries. Every promise of employment in construction, every license to open a business, every public contract was tied to political commitments. In this way, elections in Sicily were transformed into a game of secret balances where candidates knew that their success depended less on campaigns and more on the clan's ability to mobilize entire neighborhoods. The bosses did not appear on the ballots as candidates, but they were the ones who ultimately decided who would occupy a seat in Rome or an office in Palermo. The most famous example of that collusion was the case of Giulio Andreotti, one of the most influential politicians of the 20th century in Italy, several times prime minister, and a symbol of Christian democratic power. Although his figure was always surrounded by controversy, and he was never definitively convicted for mafia association, Testimonies and judicial investigations painted a troubling picture. According to several justice collaborators, Andreotti had maintained direct contacts with bosses of the Cosa Nostra, receiving electoral support and offering in return a network of political protection. It was not an isolated link, but rather the clearest expression of a widespread practice. Politics needed the mafia to secure its dominance in Sicily, and the mafia needed politics to shield its business from justice. The connections were not always visible, because the strength of the system resided in opacity. Words were whispered, messages were transmitted through intermediaries, and discreet meetings were organized in secluded villas. Favors could take many different forms, from manipulating public contracts to halting an inconvenient investigation or transferring an overly rigorous official to another post. All of this fed a vicious circle in which the mafia presented itself as a necessary power, and politics accepted that necessity as part of the game. The Cold War, moreover, offered a perfect framework for this coexistence. The United States saw Italy as a fundamental bastion against the expansion of communism, and the Christian Democracy Party was the political barrier that prevented the rise of the Communist Party. In that context, Italian governments enjoyed international protection that made it more difficult to publicly expose their shadows. The mafia benefited from this dynamic because, by guaranteeing electoral support and stability in Sicily, it indirectly reinforced the national political balance that was of such interest to the Western powers. But while politics received votes and the mafia received protection, Sicilian society paid a very high price. Local institutions were infiltrated to the core, public resources were diverted into private pockets, and clientelism became the only path to social mobility. Ordinary people learned to live with the idea that in order to obtain anything, from a job to state aid, it was necessary to go through an intermediary, who was almost always connected to the clans. The democratic state seemed distant and abstract, while the power of the mafia was immediate, tangible, and close. The pact of silence worked until violence overflowed the limits. In the 1970s and 1980s, internal wars between clans and attacks against judges and police made it increasingly clear that the mafia was not a local problem, but a national threat. The corpses that appeared in the streets of Palermo and the explosions that shook wealthy neighborhoods began to gain media attention, and public opinion started to ask how it was possible that the state, with all its judicial and police machinery, could not stop this escalation of terror. The first major trials against the mafia, such as those driven by Judge Cesare Terranova and later by Giovanni Falcone, revealed an uncomfortable truth: that mafia families did not act alone, but within a network of complicities that reached the very heart of Italian politics. The statements of the pentiti, the justice collaborators, confirmed what for decades had been an open secret: that there were senators, mayors, ministers, and officials who maintained regular dealings with the clans. The impact of these revelations was devastating. For many Italians, discovering the scale of that relationship was equivalent to accepting that the state had coexisted for years with its worst enemy, that it had turned a blind eye in exchange for stability and votes. The image of Andreotti sitting in a courtroom to respond for his alleged mafia ties symbolized that historical ambiguity, although time and judicial verdicts saved him from a definitive conviction. The shadow never completely disappeared, and his case became an uncomfortable mirror for an entire political class accustomed to coexisting with the mafia, as if it were a necessary evil. The balance, however, could not be sustained indefinitely. Growing violence, international drug trafficking, and the pressure of a new generation of judges committed to legality pushed Italian politics to a crossroads. Either the tacit pact with the clans was maintained, accepting that the mafia was a structural part of the system, or they would confront it directly, at the risk of opening a frontal war. That tension would shape the course of the 1990s, when the assassinations of judges such as Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino forced the state to react with unprecedented severity. The truth is that decades of complicity left deep scars. In the collective memory of Sicily and of all Italy remained the feeling that the institutions had failed, that the democratic state had allowed a parallel power to develop under its protection. And that wound, although partially healed with later trials, continues to remind us that the power of the mafia was not sustained only with guns and threats, but also with the silent complicity of those who should have fought it. The war against the judges. In the heart of Palermo, among narrow streets, buildings corroded by humidity, and balconies that seemed to observe everything, an unprecedented confrontation was taking shape at the beginning of the 1980s. After decades of silence and complicity, a group of judges and prosecutors decided that the time had come to tear the mask off the Cosa Nostra. Until then, judicial proceedings against mafiosi had been small, scattered, and easy to manipulate. Evidence disappeared, witnesses retracted their statements, and the accused ended up free due to lack of proof. The mafia had managed to turn the judicial system into a playing field tailored to its needs. But that dynamic changed with the emergence of magistrates like Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, who not only believed it was truly possible to strike the organization, but were willing to risk everything to achieve it. The first major step had been taken by Cesare Terranova, a judge who in the 1970s had tried to challenge the mafia from the courts. His assassination in 1979 demonstrated the ferocity with which the organization defended its interests, but it also planted a seed, the conviction that it was necessary to confront it with new tools. That idea took form in what was called the Anti-Mafia Pool, a group of magistrates who shared information, strategies, and decisions, breaking with the tradition that each judge worked in isolation. The mafia could intimidate one man, but it was much harder to frighten a cohesive team. Falcone, meticulous and analytical, understood that the key was to follow the money trail. While many colleagues continued to seek direct witnesses of murders, he tracked bank transfers, accounts in Switzerland, suspicious public contracts. He knew that violence was the visible face of the mafia, but that its true power resided in the wealth it accumulated. Borsellino, more temperamental, complemented that strategy with an extraordinary ability to interrogate witnesses and obtain confessions. Together, they created a method that combined financial intelligence and judicial persuasion, managing for the first time to build a solid case against the bosses. The key piece of that offensive was the collaboration of Tommaso Buscetta, a mafioso who, after losing much of his family in internal wars, decided to break the oath of silence and reveal what he knew. His confessions allowed the judges to reconstruct the internal hierarchy of the Cosa Nostra, to describe the role of the commission, that secret body where the family bosses decided common strategies, and to prove that the mafia was not a sum of scattered gangs, but a unified organization with its own rules and extraordinary power. It was like illuminating a room that for centuries had remained in shadow. With that evidence, the path was open to what became known as the Maxi Trial of Palermo, inaugurated in 1986 in a fortified courtroom, almost a bunker, designed to withstand attacks. There, more than 400 defendants were judged, from small soldiers to high-ranking bosses. The sessions lasted for months, and the judicial spectacle captured the attention of all of Italy and the world. For the first time, the Cosa Nostra could not escape through legal technicalities. There were direct confessions, documentary evidence, and a coherent judicial narrative that proved the existence of the organization and its responsibility for hundreds of crimes. The verdict was historic. Hundreds of convictions, including several life sentences, marked a before and after in the fight against the mafia. The state, which for decades had shown weakness, now demonstrated that it could strike at the heart of the organization. For Sicilian society, the Maxi trial meant a glimpse of hope. If it was possible to put the most feared bosses on the defendant's bench, then it was also possible to dream of a Sicily freed from the mafia's yoke. But the mafia was not willing to accept such a challenge without reacting. Toto Riina, undisputed leader of the Corleonesi, conceived a strategy of terror designed to crush the judges and send a message to the state. Every step against the organization would carry an unbearable cost. The response was brutal. In 1989, Giovanni Falcone miraculously survived an assassination attempt while vacationing in Adaura. Explosives placed on the beach nearly ended his life. 3 years later, in May of 1992, the threat was fulfilled. On the highway that connects Palermo's airport with the city, a charge of 500 kilograms of dynamite blew up the car in which Falcone was traveling with his wife and several bodyguards. The images of the destroyed road traveled around the world and left all of Italy in shock. Barely 2 months later, in July of the same year, Paolo Borsellino was murdered in an equally devastating attack in front of his mother's house. The mafia had eliminated the 2 men who symbolized judicial resistance, proving that it was willing to challenge the state directly with unprecedented violence. The popular reaction was immediate. Thousands of Sicilians took to the streets, no longer in fearful silence, but with banners and cries of outrage. Society, which for decades had accepted the mafia's presence with resignation, discovered in those assassinations a red line that could not be tolerated. The funerals of Falcone and Borsellino became massive events, with citizens of all ages publicly swearing that the sacrifice of the judges would not be in vain. The state, pressured by social outrage and international attention, launched an unprecedented offensive. New laws increased penalties. Mafia assets were confiscated. Security measures for judges and prosecutors were reinforced, and the use of collaborators of justice was promoted, which made it possible to obtain even more confessions. For the first time, the Cosa Nostra found itself besieged on every front: economic, judicial, and social. The war against the judges was a turning point because it showed that the mafia could be struck, but also because it revealed the price that had to be paid for such a confrontation. The sacrifice of Falcone and Borsellino was engraved in Italian memory as a reminder that justice requires extreme courage, and that every step toward truth can awaken the darkest forces. That period marked the beginning of a new stage in the relationship between the state and the Cosa Nostra, a stage in which confrontation would be open and violent, and where the mafia would discover that the strategy of terror could turn against it by awakening an unprecedented social resistance. The bombs on the continent. After the assassination of Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, Italy was plunged into deep shock. The pain over the loss of those judges mingled with a growing rage, and in the streets there was a sense that society was finally ready to confront the power of the mafia. However, far from being intimidated, the bosses of Cosa Nostra decided to double down on their challenge against the state. In their logic, violence was a political weapon. If the attacks managed to spread fear among the population and weaken confidence in the institutions, then the rulers would be forced to negotiate. It was in that climate that a new phase began, marked by a chain of attacks that for the first time carried the mafia's terror outside of Sicily to strike directly at the cultural and political heart of Italy. Totò Riina, the capo dei capi of the Corleonesi, had already shown that he could eliminate the most uncomfortable enemies. But after the executions of Falcone and Borsellino, the state reacted with unprecedented harshness. Massive arrests, military patrols in Sicily, stricter laws. The police pressure made many bosses begin to fear for the survival of the organization. It was then that Riina and his men conceived a strategy of terror, aimed not only at judges or police officers, but also at symbols of Italian heritage and at innocent civilians. The message was brutal. If the state did not yield, the mafia was willing to set the entire country on fire. In the year 1993, the most remembered attacks of this campaign began. The first took place in May, in Florence, the cradle of the Renaissance. An explosive charge went off in front of the Uffizi Gallery, one of the most important museums in the world. The blast destroyed historic buildings, damaged priceless works of art, and, most tragically, killed several people, including children who were sleeping in nearby homes. The whole of Italy was horrified. The mafia was no longer killing in nighttime ambushes or on isolated roads. Now it was striking at the culture, the memory, and the beauty of an entire country. Barely 2 months later, another bomb shook Rome, in the district of St. John Lateran, near the Basilica. The attack did not target a specific judge or politician, but rather sought to sow panic in the spiritual heart of the capital. On the same day, another explosion destroyed part of the Church of St. George in Velabro, a medieval jewel. The strategy was evident: to attack places loaded with symbolic meaning in order to show that the Mafia could wound the soul of Italy. On the 27th of July, Milan became the scene of a devastating attack. A van packed with explosives detonated in Via Palestro, near the Gallery of Modern Art. The blast killed 5 people, including firefighters who had gone to investigate a suspicious vehicle. The explosion shook the center of the city and made it clear that no city was safe. In just a few months, the Mafia had turned the industrial north, the political capital, and the cultural jewel of Italy into battlefields. These bombs were not isolated acts, but part of a strategy that some investigators interpreted as an attempt to pressure the state into softening the prison conditions of mafiosi convicted in the Maxi trial. Among those conditions, the most feared was Article 41BS, which imposed strict isolation on imprisoned bosses, cutting off their communication with the outside world. For Cosa Nostra, this measure was equivalent to a mortal blow, because it prevented the bosses from continuing to direct their businesses from behind bars. The bombs were, in a way, large-scale blackmail. If the prison regime was not eased, the attacks would continue. But the effect was not the one expected. Although some sectors of the state showed hesitation, social outrage was so great that the government was forced to maintain a hard line. For the first time, Mafia terror was not generating submission, but repulsion. The images of a destroyed Florence, of the rubble in Rome, and of the innocent victims of Milan touched even those who, until then, considered the Mafia to be a distant problem confined to Sicily. Suddenly, the entire country felt vulnerable. The change in social climate coincided with a decisive event: the capture of Totorina in January of 1993. After decades in hiding, the head of the Corleonesi was arrested in Palermo thanks to meticulous police investigation. His fall represented an enormous symbolic blow, and many interpreted it as the beginning of the end for a strategy of terror that had failed in its objectives. Nevertheless, the Mafia still retained the capacity to inflict harm, and the bombs of that year demonstrated it with stark clarity. In the midst of this scenario, another key figure emerged: Bernardo Provenzano, the successor of Riina. More calculating and less bloodthirsty, he understood that unrestrained violence was weakening the organization. Under his leadership, Cosa Nostra began a shift towards a lower profile, privileging economic infiltration and discretion over open terrorism. However, the memory of the bombs was etched into Italian memory as a reminder of how far the Mafia was willing to go when it felt cornered. The explosions of 1993 also marked a turning point in the international perception of the Mafia. The cultural community reacted with indignation at the attack on Florence. Museums, universities, and foreign governments publicly condemned the attacks, and initiatives for cooperation against organized crime multiplied. Italy was no longer alone in its struggle. The world had seen that the Mafia was a threat not only to Sicily or to Italian politics, but to the cultural heritage of all humanity. The legacy of that campaign of terror is complex. On the one hand, it showed the brutality of Cosa Nostra in its most desperate moment, capable of killing innocents and destroying centuries of history to defend its interests. On the other hand, it accelerated a reaction from the state and society that significantly weakened the organization. The fear that was meant to paralyze Italians ended up uniting many of them in a common conviction: the Mafia could no longer dictate the destiny of the country. With time, the ruins of the attacks were restored, the churches reopened their doors, and the wounded cities regained their rhythm. But the scars remained, invisible to many, engraved in the memory of those who survived, and in the conscience of a nation that had learned that beauty itself could be a target of Mafia hatred. After Riina. When Toto Riina was captured in January of 1993, many believed that the Sicilian Mafia had received its definitive blow. That man, known as the Beast, had embodied the brutality of the 1980s and the early 1990s, with indiscriminate murders and a blood strategy that seemed to have no limits. However, what few imagined was that his fall would open the way to a new stage, marked by a radically different style, in which silence would replace bombs, and in which the Mafia would find new ways to maintain its power without attracting the fire of the state and society. At the center of that transformation was one man, Bernardo Provenzano. Nicknamed Binu Utraturi, the tractor, because of his apparent physical clumsiness and his slow way of speaking, Provenzano was in reality a cold and calculating strategist. For years, he had been the right-hand man of Riina, but unlike his boss, he had never enjoyed the spectacle of violence. Riina sought to instill fear with every killing, convinced that terror was the best weapon to subjugate both his rivals and the state. Provenzano, on the other hand, believed in a more discreet method: less noise, more business. His philosophy was that the Mafia had to become invisible, blending with the social and economic fabric, operating in the shadows like a silent but omnipresent force. His rise to leadership was not immediate. After Riina's capture, an internal struggle broke out in which other bosses tried to seize the throne of Cosa Nostra. But Provenzano knew how to wait, to gain support little by little, and to consolidate himself as the figure capable of restoring order in an organization shaken by internal war and by the state's offensive. For many clans exhausted by excessive violence, his figure represented stability. One of Provenzano's first decisions was to abandon the strategy of spectacular attacks. Under his command, the Mafia stopped attacking symbols of the state and focused on rebuilding its business networks. Instead of unleashing open wars, he sought mediation between rival families, convinced that internal division weakened everyone. His style earned him the nickname Il Ragioniere, the accountant, because he seemed more like an administrator than a bloodthirsty capo. In a certain way, that was exactly what Cosa Nostra needed. Someone who would make it profitable again without drawing the constant gaze of the press and justice. Provenzano's power was consolidated thanks to a very particular characteristic of his leadership: communication through pizzini. These small pieces of paper, handwritten in cryptic language, were the only way he transmitted orders from his hideout. He never used telephones or electronic devices, aware that any interception could betray him. The pizzini traveled from hand to hand, from messenger to messenger, until they reached their final destination. It was a slow but infallible system that for years kept Provenzano hidden from the authorities, while he continued governing the organization from the shadows. In economic matters, he clearly saw where the opportunities lay. In the late 1990s and the early 2000s, Cosa Nostra strengthened its infiltration in construction, waste management, agricultural trade, and service companies. The strategy consisted of placing illicit money in legal businesses, bidding on public contracts, and controlling entire sectors through front companies. Sicily, with its dependence on European and state funds for development, became fertile ground for this form of silent expansion. The less violence there was in the streets, the harder it was for the common citizen to realize the magnitude of mafia power in the economy. Provenzano's shift also influenced relations with politics. The mafia, weakened after the trials of the 1990s, needed allies to guarantee protection. Under his command, contacts were managed more discreetly than ever, seeking local agreements, favors in town councils, and quiet deals in bidding processes. It was no longer about big pacts with national parties, but rather about a more capillary network, where each clan ensured it had some politician, businessman, or official under its influence. The figure of Provenzano grew until it became a myth. His ability to hide for more than 40 years turned him into a kind of ghost, a shadow impossible to capture. Every police attempt ended in nothing, and his whereabouts became an obsession for Italian justice. His name appeared in rumors, suspicions, and stories passed from mouth to mouth, but there was never concrete proof of where he was. For many, it seemed as if he had vanished into nothingness. The Sicilian population perceived that change of style. After decades of car bombs and shootouts in the middle of the street, the silence of the Provenzano years felt almost like a relief. But beneath that apparent calm was a structure that continued to control daily life. Extortion, manipulated contracts, control of agricultural trade, everything remained in place, although with less visible violence. The mafia had not disappeared. It had become invisible. That camouflage was precisely Provenzano's great move. While the state celebrated Rina's capture and the apparent decline of violence, the organization continued generating money and extending its influence. Silence was his best weapon. He did not need newspaper headlines. He only needed signed contracts, secured favors, and briefcases of money moving between discreet hands. His reign was, in many ways, less spectacular but more efficient. Finally, in 2006, after decades of pursuit, the Italian police managed to locate him in a farmhouse in Corleone. He was 73 years old, sick, and living in almost monastic conditions, surrounded by papers, medicines, and the famous pizzini. His capture was a symbolic triumph, but it also revealed how difficult it had been to catch a man who had made silence and discretion his greatest shield. The legacy of Bernardo Provenzano is ambiguous. For some, he was responsible for the mafia's survival during the hardest time of repression, rebuilding itself from within and adapting to a new century. For others, he was the man who kept alive a machinery of corruption and exploitation that, although more silent, continued to deeply harm Sicily and all of Italy. His style contrasted with that of Rina, but both shared the same objective: to preserve the power of Cosa Nostra at all costs. Thus, the story of the mafia after the fall of Riina was not an end, but a metamorphosis. The noisy beast gave way to the silent accountant, and the result was an organization that learned to be less visible, but no less influential. The Camorra, chaos as a method. While Cosa Nostra was retreating after the years of terror and learning to disguise itself as a silent machinery under the command of Bernardo Provenzano in the south of Italy, more specifically in Naples and its region, another criminal organization was showing that not all mafias needed the rigid discipline of the Sicilians in order to prosper. It was the Camorra, a universe where power was not built with strict hierarchies or with codes of honor transmitted for centuries, but with an almost immeasurable network of clans that were constantly forming, breaking apart, and clashing against each other. Chaos, far from being an obstacle, became the very essence of its survival. The Camorra has very ancient roots, so much so that some trace it back to local protection societies during the time of the Kingdom of Naples, when territorial control was weak and cities needed alternative forms of authority. But its true rise began to be felt throughout the 20th century, when the urban dynamics of Naples, its population density, structural poverty, and political corruption offered the perfect stage for the proliferation of clans. Unlike the Sicilian Mafia, which maintained a rigid initiation system and a pyramidal structure, the Camorra was characterized by the multiplicity of families that operated simultaneously, without a single center of power. Each neighborhood, each street, could be the territory of a different group, and the balances were resolved with gunfire, lightning-fast acts of revenge, and localized wars that seemed never to end. What is fascinating about the Camorra is that its apparent disorganization did not mean weakness. On the contrary, that fragmentation was an advantage that made it almost invulnerable to major strikes from the state. When justice captured a Sicilian boss, the impact could decapitate an entire organization. In Naples, however, if a boss was arrested, another would take his place within hours, and if one clan disappeared, 3 more would arise to divide the business among themselves. It was like a monster with multiple heads, impossible to cut off at the root. For decades, its main source of income was cigarette smuggling. From the docks of Naples, shipments would leave that flooded not only Italy, but a large part of Europe, in a business that moved millions and was protected by port complicities and international networks. But over time, the Camorra diversified its activities, entering drug trafficking, counterfeiting, extortion, arms trafficking, and even the management of toxic waste. In this last field, it found a gold mine. Large industrial companies from the north of Italy, and even from other European countries, preferred to pay the Camorra to illegally dispose of their chemical waste rather than face the legal costs of doing it properly. Thus, tons of poisons ended up buried in farmland in Campania, contaminating the soil and the water in what is known as the Land of Fires. Violence was an inseparable part of Camorra life. Naples experienced, especially between the 1980s and 1990s, true urban carnages, with bodies lying in the streets, score settling in broad daylight, and a sense of insecurity that permeated every corner of the city. The phenomenon reached such a point that the writer Roberto Saviano, in his famous work Gomorrah, described with starkness how fear and the normalization of violence had turned the Camorra into a parallel power impossible to ignore. His testimony earned him death threats and forced him to live under permanent protection, but it also exposed to the entire world the magnitude of an organization that had globalized itself without ever abandoning its local roots. Unlike Cosa Nostra, which always sought a veneer of respectability and cultivated ties with politicians and businessmen in the shadows, the Camorra had a much more visible face in the neighborhoods. The clans imposed their authority directly, with young bosses, sometimes barely over 20 years old, who rode large motorcycles, surrounded by bodyguards and symbols of ostentation. Their closeness to the people of the neighborhood generated an ambiguous relationship. On one hand, the Camorristi were feared, but on the other hand, they could be seen as figures of immediate power, capable of providing jobs in the informal economy, distributing favors, and exercising a twisted form of street justice. The fragmentation of the Camorra also meant that the role of women was much more visible than in other mafias. Widows of murdered bosses, sisters, or even mothers of fallen leaders would take control of the clans, running operations with the same toughness as men. In a world where the life of leaders could last only months before falling under bullets, women became figures of continuity, guardians of the networks and of the money that sustained each family. The power of the Camorra was not limited to the streets of Naples. Its networks extended to Spain, where they found fertile ground for drug trafficking, especially on the Costa del Sol. They also penetrated markets as diverse as fashion, flooding Italy with counterfeit clothing or food, adulterating products and controlling the distribution of entire chains. Their flexibility to jump from one business to another made them an extremely adaptable organization, capable of reading the opportunities of each era without being tied to a single sector. The state, of course, responded with operations, arrests, and trials, but fighting the Camorra was like battling against a fog. Each blow dismantled one clan, but did not weaken the whole. Local corruption, structural poverty, and social complicity in some neighborhoods facilitated its permanence. Many citizens, trapped in misery, preferred to accept Camorra power as an inevitable reality, a force that, although dangerous, was more immediate than the institutions of the state. As the years passed, the Camorra developed an unusual capacity to coexist with chaos. While other mafias needed the stability of clear hierarchies, the Camorra found strength in its disorder. That quality, incomprehensible from the outside, was in reality its greatest weapon. Anarchy turned into a method of control. Today, although it has lost part of its brutal visibility after the years of bloody wars, the Camorra continues to be one of the most active mafias in Italy, expanded into multiple sectors and present in international businesses. Its name has become synonymous with urban violence, but also a reminder of how criminality can adapt to social and economic environments in an almost organic way, like a fabric that intertwines with the city itself. The history of the Camorra is the history of a monster that does not need crowns or thrones, because it feeds on chaos, and in that chaos, it finds its stability. The 'Ndrangheta, the silent queen of drug trafficking. While the Camorra kept Naples in a whirlwind of chaos, and the Sicilian Cosa Nostra dealt with the harshest blows it had ever received from the state, in the south of Italy, in a rough and forgotten land, another criminal organization was silently growing until it became the most powerful mafia empire in Europe. The region was Calabria, the tip of the Italian boot, a place of inhospitable mountains, steep coasts, and towns where poverty had taken root for generations. There, far from the great urban centers, and almost always outside the concerns of central power, the 'Ndrangheta developed, a mafia that learned to hide, to blend in, and that thanks to such discretion would end up spreading its tentacles all over the world. The origin of the 'Ndrangheta can be traced back to the 19th century, when Calabrian family clans began to organize themselves to control lands and local businesses. Unlike the Sicilian Mafia, whose base rested on a complex structure of cosche and more visible hierarchies, the 'Ndrangheta relied from the very beginning on the biological family as its essential core. Blood was the true cement of its organization. Being part of the 'Ndrangheta meant being born into a lineage, and that belonging was almost impossible to break. While in Sicily, a man could be recruited for merit or loyalty, in Calabria membership was passed down like a surname. This logic created bonds of loyalty far more solid, but also more closed, difficult for the authorities to penetrate and sealed off against any kind of infiltration. For decades, the 'Ndrangheta remained in the shadows, devoted to traditional activities such as extortion, the kidnapping of wealthy individuals for ransom, and the control of public works in Calabria. Kidnappings in particular were a spectacular source of income during the 1970s. Entire families of the Italian bourgeoisie lived in constant fear that a son, a father, or a brother would be abducted in broad daylight and hidden in the Calabrian mountains while multi-million sums were negotiated. Many of those ransoms served as the initial capital that allowed the 'Ndrangheta to launch itself into much more lucrative businesses in the future. That future was called cocaine. Starting in the 1980s and with unstoppable growth during the 1990s, the 'Ndrangheta became the main intermediary in drug trafficking in Europe, thanks to a direct relationship with the South American cartels. While the Cosa Nostra had lost power after the massacres of Capaci and Via D'Amelio, and the Camorra was too fragmented to control large international networks, the Calabrian clans knew how to take advantage of their discretion and their family cohesion to present themselves to the Colombian drug lords as trustworthy partners. The key was the port of Gioia Tauro in Calabria, one of the largest port infrastructures in the Mediterranean. There, shipping containers were the perfect hiding place for tons of cocaine arriving from South America and later redistributed across all of Europe. The business reached colossal dimensions. It is estimated that nowadays, the 'Ndrangheta controls around 80% of the cocaine that enters the European continent, moving multi-million sums that surpass the budget of many states. They did it without the need for ostentation or visible bloody wars. Their style was that of a low profile, of patient infiltration. While the Sicilian Mafia had drawn the world's attention with its car bombs and its murders of judges, the 'Ndrangheta prospered in silence, infiltrating banks, construction companies, transport companies, and even the political system itself. Their expansion was dazzling. From Calabria, they extended branches into Lombardy, Piedmont, and Emilia-Romagna, industrial regions in the north of Italy where money flowed in enormous amounts and where the need to move fresh capital offered an ideal terrain for money laundering. But they did not stop there. Germany became one of their most important operational centers, with notable presence in cities such as Duisburg, where in 2007 a massacre between Calabrian clans made it clear to Europe that the 'Ndrangheta was not a distant legend, but a real threat on its own territory. Spain, Canada, Australia, and even West Africa were added to its map of influence, creating a global network that made it unmatched compared to other European mafias. One of the most intriguing elements of the 'Ndrangheta is its rituality. Despite its low profile, it maintains a series of secret ceremonies for the initiation of its members, inspired by religious symbols and heavily weighted by tradition. The mixture of family, blood, and sacredness gives its membership an almost mystical aura, and it strengthens internal bonds in a way that is difficult to comprehend from the outside. In a world where betrayal can mean immediate death, the 'Ndrangheta built a system in which betrayal became improbable from the beginning, because it implied breaking not only with the organization, but with one's own blood family. Its ability to infiltrate the legal economy is another of its characteristic traits. Construction, commerce, the food sector, and even tourism served as fronts to launder drug trafficking money. They invested in restaurants, hotels, transport companies, and seemingly innocent businesses that in reality functioned as gears of a gigantic machinery. Meanwhile, they quietly bought land, participated in public tenders, and financed local political campaigns. The result was that in some regions of Italy, the border between the legitimate economy and the money of the 'Ndrangheta became blurred, almost impossible to distinguish. The power achieved by the 'Ndrangheta in the 21st century placed it above the Cosa Nostra and the Camorra, to the point that many experts consider it today the richest and most powerful criminal organization in Europe. Its strength does not lie in spectacular violence, but in its ability to infiltrate like a virus into the economic and social system. It is the mafia that learned to reign without the need to shout, the one that hides behind the facades of respectable businesses and that turns its invisibility into its most lethal weapon. European states have reacted with police operations and massive trials, known in Italy as maxi trials, where hundreds of members of the 'Ndrangheta are brought to justice in trials that last for years. However, dismantling an organization based on the family is extremely complicated. Even when dozens of bosses are imprisoned, the clans remain alive because the sons, cousins, and nephews assume leadership, maintaining the continuity of the criminal lineage. The family root, which in other societies is a symbol of stability, in Calabria has become the strongest armor against the assaults of the state. The 'Ndrangheta represents the most sophisticated face of modern organized crime. Its rise from the marginality of Calabria to the peak of global drug trafficking is a story of patience, of strategic invisibility, and of a strict discipline that knew how to wait for its moment. While the other mafias consumed themselves in wars, it grew stronger. Today, its name resonates as a warning. True power is not always the one that is displayed. Sometimes it is the one that remains hidden. International expansion. The Italian mafias were born as local phenomena, deeply rooted in specific territories and with identities strongly marked by the human and geographic landscape of Sicily, Naples, or Calabria. However, the 20th century offered them a much broader stage. The entire world became fertile ground for their businesses, and Italian organized crime undertook a process of expansion that transformed it into a global force. The history of that expansion is, in many ways, the history of a criminal diaspora, a wave that traveled together with Italian emigrants and that found in foreign lands new opportunities to flourish. The first great leap abroad was marked by the massive migration of Italians to the United States at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. Millions of poor men and women, mostly from the south of Italy and from Sicily, left in search of a better life, escaping from the misery and marginalization that prevailed in their native lands. They arrived at ports such as New York, New Orleans, or Chicago, carrying light suitcases and enormous hopes. But they also brought with them the old traditions of community organization, the networks of fellow countrymen, and in some cases, the seed of the mafia. In those overcrowded neighborhoods where discrimination was part of everyday life, the ties between compatriots were essential for survival, and there the secret societies and mafia clans found fertile ground. In New York, for example, the first Sicilian groups began by exercising the same kind of control they had in their towns of origin: protection, extortion, and control of street markets. These were times when the American police hardly understood how these organizations operated, and much less were they able to infiltrate them. That gap allowed characters such as Giuseppe Morello or the Genovese brothers to lay the foundations of what would later become the all-powerful American Cosa Nostra. Prohibition, which banned the sale of alcohol between 1920 and 1933, was the turning point. The Italian Mafia, together with Irish and Jewish groups, entered the business of liquor smuggling, amassing fortunes and consolidating a power that was no longer limited to immigrant neighborhoods, but reached into the highest spheres of politics and business. The model that was consolidated in the United States, with the famous Five Families of New York and legendary figures such as Lucky Luciano, had an inspiring effect on the Italian mafias of origin. It was proof that organized crime could transcend the local sphere and become a transnational actor. At the same time, the connection between Sicily and America remained alive. Trips, marriages, and strategic alliances created a constant bridge through which ideas, methods, and money circulated. In many ways, the Sicilian Mafia became globalized long before Italy itself dreamed of doing so. But the expansion was not limited to the United States. In Canada, especially in cities such as Montreal and Toronto, the Calabrian clans found a privileged space to grow. There, the 'Ndrangheta settled firmly, and in a short time it controlled a large part of the drug trade in the country. The Calabrian advantage lay in its family structure, which made it easier for entire clans to move abroad without losing internal cohesion. It was not uncommon for a family group that dominated a town in Calabria to replicate almost identically in a neighborhood in Toronto, maintaining the same rituals, the same hierarchies, and even the same obedience to the mother house in Italy. In Australia, they also found fertile ground. Since the decade of 1920, Italian immigrants carried with them traditions and mafia structures that gradually adapted to the new environment. The 'Ndrangheta, once again, played a central role in cities such as Melbourne and Sydney, where the Calabrian clans became involved in smuggling, illegal gambling, and later drug trafficking. Their ability to camouflage themselves among the Italian diaspora allowed them to go unnoticed for decades, while consolidating a network that today is considered one of the most powerful branches of the organization outside Europe. In South America, the expansion took a different path, more connected to the search for refuge than to the direct control of markets. During the 1960s and 70s, many Italian mafiosi fleeing justice found asylum in countries such as Argentina, Brazil, or Venezuela, where they lived under new identities and often rebuilt illegal businesses in alliance with local mafias. In those years, Buenos Aires became a key point of connection between the Italian mafia and the drug smuggling that began to flow from South America to Europe. In Brazil, the port of Santos became one of the preferred platforms of the 'Ndrangheta for sending cocaine, to the point that today it continues to be a strategic enclave of the organization. Another fundamental chapter of international expansion was the landing in Central and Northern Europe. Germany, Switzerland, Belgium, and the Netherlands became first-class refugees and logistical centers. In Germany, the presence of the 'Ndrangheta is so strong that it has generated political alarm. The Duisburg massacre in 2007, with 6 members of a clan murdered in front of an Italian restaurant, was a brutal reminder that the wars of Calabria could be transferred to the heart of Europe. In the Netherlands, Italian mafias found an ideal space in the port of Rotterdam, another of the great nodes of the international drug trade. What is fascinating about this expansion is that it was not simply a violent colonization, as movies often portray. It was, above all, a process of silent infiltration, where the Italian mafias embedded themselves in immigrant communities, took advantage of ties of kinship, camouflaged themselves in the legality of small businesses, and little by little extended their networks until they covered international operations. That style allowed them to go unnoticed for decades, consolidating power without the need to display it ostentatiously. Today, Italian organized crime is a global phenomenon. The Cosa Nostra maintains historical ties with America. The Camorra has specialized in smuggling goods and in the trafficking of toxic waste with international ramifications, and the 'Ndrangheta reigns over global drug trafficking with a presence on every continent. Together, They are capable of moving billions of euros every year, laundering money in Swiss banks, investing in skyscrapers in Dubai, and negotiating on equal terms with the cartels of Mexico or Colombia. The diaspora of Italian crime demonstrates that the mafia is not simply a local problem of Italy, but an actor that has learned to play on the board of globalization. Wherever there is a port, a community of emigrants, or a lucrative market, it is likely that there is some trace of its presence. International expansion gave them longevity and strength, and ensured that even when the Italian state managed to strike hard at home, the organization could resist thanks to its bases abroad. The map of Italian crime in the 21st century is a complex and globalized network, in which tradition mixes with modernity, and the old mafia ceremonies coexist with electronic transfers and offshore accounts. It is the reflection of how an organization born in the poorest villages of southern Italy managed to establish itself in the heart of global capitalism, adapting to each territory without ever losing its identity. The future of the Italian Mafia. Speaking about the future of the Italian Mafia means stepping into a field full of uncertainty, because it is a phenomenon that has shown, for more than 150 years, an extraordinary ability to adapt. Every time the state believed it had delivered a final blow, the criminal organizations knew how to mutate, retreat, reinvent themselves, and then reappear with more strength. History teaches that the mafia is not an enemy that disappears with the death of a boss, nor with the dissolution of a family. It is a living, flexible system, deeply rooted in the cracks of society. The destiny of these organizations is marked, first of all, by the challenge of globalization. For much of the 20th century, the Italian mafia was essentially a local actor, one that controlled territories and regional economies. But in the 21st century, crime knows no borders. Capital flows instantly through banks and tax havens, goods circulate in containers that cross oceans in a matter of days, and drug trafficking has become a multinational enterprise. In that context, the Calabrian 'Ndrangheta has positioned itself as the mafia organization best prepared for the future, because its family structure guarantees indestructible loyalties, and its control of cocaine trafficking gives it colossal financial power. The immediate future seems to show that drug trafficking will continue to be the backbone of these organizations. Cocaine, in particular, maintains an extremely high demand in Europe, and the Italian mafias have become privileged partners of the Latin American cartels, especially in Colombia, Peru, and Mexico. It is not an exaggeration to affirm that without the distribution logistics and money laundering provided by the 'Ndrangheta, a great part of the cocaine that floods the streets of Berlin, London, or Milan would never reach its destination. And what is most disturbing is that this transatlantic alliance has consolidated to the point where the Calabrian clans act as trustworthy intermediaries, capable of guaranteeing security in operations and solving disputes without the need to spill blood. However, the future of the Italian mafia is not limited to drug trafficking. Another field where it has shown a surprising capacity for anticipation is that of legal businesses linked to the global economy. For years, the Italian mafias were seen only as networks of extortion and smuggling, but today they have learned to move in the financial world with a skill that rivals international banks. They have invested in renewable energies, in waste recycling, in the construction of large public works, and even in high technology sectors. There, hidden among numbers and contracts, illicit capital mixes with licit capital, and it is almost impossible to trace its origin. The future presents a scenario where the mafia will not only be an armed threat in working-class neighborhoods, but also an invisible partner at the great tables of business. Another crucial aspect is the ability to infiltrate politics. The recent history of Italy has shown cases in which renowned politicians fell because of their links with the mafia, and although legislation has been made tougher, criminal organizations still find ways to influence decision-making. In the future, the struggle against this type of infiltration will be even more complex, because it is no longer only about local candidates financed by clans in small municipalities, but about international lobbies that seek to shape energy, environmental, or commercial policies on a European scale. In a world where political borders seem increasingly blurred, the Mafia is learning to play the game of hidden diplomacy. The future also presents a generational challenge inside the organizations. The old figures of almost legendary bosses who imposed respect with their mere presence have been disappearing. In their place, young men emerge who have been educated in universities, with knowledge of law, economics, or engineering, and who apply those skills in service of the organization. This professionalization of crime guarantees that the Italian mafias will not remain anchored in a romantic past of pistols and codes of honor, but will evolve into hybrid entities, where business and crime are confused in a single reality. The future of the Mafia will be, to a great extent, that of a modern company, with flexible hierarchies, diversified investments, and the ability to adapt to market opportunities. But there are also shadows on the horizon. The Italian state, in alliance with the European Union and with international organizations, has understood that the struggle against organized crime can no longer be limited to police operations. Today there exist networks of judicial cooperation, financial control systems, and intelligence technologies that were once unthinkable. The use of algorithms to track suspicious capital movements, the crossing of international databases, and the collaboration between prosecutors from different countries represent powerful weapons against the mafias. The future will undoubtedly show increasingly sophisticated battles where the power of criminal organizations will be measured against the technological and legal capacity of the states. However, here emerges the great paradox. Every time a mafia network is squeezed in one country, it tends to expand into another where control is more lax. It is like a living organism that, when attacked in one spot, moves its energy to another. That is why the future of the Italian Mafia does not depend solely on Italy, but on the global capacity to confront it in a coordinated way. If there is a gap in Africa, in Asia, or in South America, there they will find fertile ground to operate, and from there they will continue feeding their empire. The cultural future of the Mafia also deserves reflection. For decades, the fascination it exerted over cinema, literature, and television contributed to feeding a sort of mythology around it. Series such as The Sopranos, or films such as The Godfather, turned the mafioso into an almost tragic character, with codes of honor and moral dilemmas. That romantic vision has served, in many cases, as a tool of recruitment and legitimization. The challenge for the future will be to dismantle that narrative, to show the reality of the violence, extortion, and pain that these organizations generate, and to strip away that halo of cultural admiration that has benefited them so much. At this point, an inevitable question arises. Could the Mafia ever disappear completely? The most realistic answer is that the only possible thing is to reduce its power, limit its influence, cut its economic tentacles. But the Mafia, as a human phenomenon that arises from inequality, corruption, and the absence of justice, will hardly ever become extinct. As long as there are societies where the state does not succeed in guaranteeing opportunities, as long as there are communities sunk in poverty or elites willing to enrich themselves at any cost, the mafias will continue to find ground to take root. The future, then, is not that of their disappearance, but that of a constant struggle to contain them. Looking ahead, what appears on the horizon is a mafia increasingly sophisticated, more silent, and less visible. A mafia that does not need to exhibit corpses in the streets to instill fear, because it controls markets from the shadows of financial offices. A mafia that does not seek so much explicit political power, but rather the ability to influence strategic decisions that affect millions of people. A mafia that, far from disappearing, seems willing to coexist with modernity, adapting to it and taking advantage of its cracks. The future of the Italian Mafia is, ultimately, the reflection of a greater dilemma, that of how human societies coexist with their own shadows. Globalization has opened immense opportunities, but it has also created spaces for organized crime to become a global force. Italy, cradle of these organizations, will continue being a central stage in that battle. But the outcome is no longer played only in Calabria, Sicily, or Naples, but in every corner of the planet where a shipment of drugs circulates, a bank transfer is made, or a public contract is signed. And perhaps there lies the most disturbing thing. The future of the Italian Mafia will not be read in the chronicles of bloody events, but in the invisible pages of contracts, balance sheets, and political decisions. In those silent shadows, where crime and legality are confused, is where the true battle for tomorrow will be fought. We have reached the end of this journey through the shadows and secrets of the Italian Mafia. If this content has captured you, leave me your opinion in the comments and subscribe so we can continue exploring new mysteries together. Thank you for joining me. Good night.